Hello, and welcome to today's episode of Talk on Things and Stuff with a special series that we're doing called Joseph Smith Was Not a Sexual Predator. This is our second episode in this series, and to bring everybody up to speed, in our first episode, we put out a call, an invitation for somebody who, being familiar with some of the reasons that critics of Joseph Smith might give him the label or descriptor of a sexual predator, we invited someone to come and to provide a perspective or way of looking at the issue of Joseph Smith's proposals in a light that may soften or eliminate that accusation, kind of give us a way of thinking about Joseph Smith that defends this perspective of him being a sexual predator. Well, we didn't get any calls during the first episode itself, but there were some people who participated in the comments on that show who gave a little bit of perspective, and then I was contacted by somebody who is a believing, active, Temple Recommend holding member who thought that they had a perspective that would be valuable to share with the audience in kind of an approach to Joseph and to polygamy that might provide an additional measure of understanding that can maybe relieve some of those critics and accusations. And according to the invitation, I said you could do it anonymously because sometimes in trying to make these explanations, there's a desire to have the freedom to speak freely without having to face consequences of people who maybe misunderstand you or take things out of context. And so we're going to afford this individual the anonymity that will allow them to speak freely. And so without further ado, hold on, I'm getting some people saying that there's audio issues. That was their issue. Okay, so let's introduce somebody that we will come to know as Xena. How are you doing today, Xena?
I'm doing pretty good. How are you, Jonathan?
I'm doing great. I want to tell you I'm very grateful. First of all, you'll hear in my voice that I'm kind of under the weather, so I'm just going to try to keep my voice in a lower register because it doesn't crack like that. I sound like a teenager otherwise. But tell me a little bit about how you stumbled across the show and what inspired you to reach out.
Okay, sure. I am in the process of discovering a lot of things that you and other people have discovered
Mm-hmm.
through searching the new information that has been out. And it's been kind of arduous and difficult. And through this, I came across your channel and have watched several of your videos. And I think that I have a different perspective, like you said, regarding this specific accusation of Joseph Smith.
Okay.
And so if you would like, I can
Well,
talk to you about stuff.
so that we understand a little bit where you're coming from, can you give us just a snapshot of where you are now in the church in terms of were you a convert? Were you born in? And what brings you to where you are right now?
Oh, okay. So yes, I was born and raised in the church. In fact, part of what I was going to talk about is my history. I have generations of history in the church, and have been active all my life. I've also been somebody who likes to research and study the gospel. I have on one side, I have my stepfather who was a scriptorian. You would consider him that. We have a huge library of church books, and he used to talk about the gospel all the time. Same with my mother. So we just really like to talk about the gospel. He would go into depths of things that most people wouldn't talk about. And so I've always had kind of that inclination.
Oh, okay, excellent. Well, it's good. It's always helpful when somebody comes to the conversation already having a rich, deep background in discussing things that maybe people haven't delved into before, because then you get an informed perspective that can bring a lot of weight to the discussion. When you first contacted me, you said that I'd like to present it to you, but it can kind of take it might even take an hour to lay out. And I know originally we thought, well, maybe we could talk about it beforehand, but I really wanted to kind of get a hot, fresh take for when I heard it for the first time. So the audience knows we haven't really discussed any of these details beforehand. I'm waiting with bated breath as to what your approach is. And with that introduction, I think I'm going to turn the time over to you just to lay things out and then invite the audience. Certainly they can comment as we're listening, but once we're all done, we'll open up the phone lines and let people ask any of those clarifying questions. And remember, in the invitation, the back and forth will not really be to try to disprove you wrong, but let's explore different ways that we can still acknowledge that there are religious sexual predators in other paradigms, and see the way that you're able to frame Joseph Smith as something different, or what he's doing is somehow different from that. And that's kind of the goal of this. And certainly, I would encourage and insist that audience members are respectful to you and to your perspective in terms of, as an individual. Certainly ideas, arguments that people find are flawed are worthy of criticism in terms of not simply just saying, oh, well, that's stupid, but really providing a counter perspective that maybe expands the discussion more. Does that sound reasonable?
That's great. That's awesome. I'll start with that.
So turn it over to you.
Okay, great. Well, to kind of go along with that, people like me, who you will soon learn have experienced a lot of pain and trauma, but I'm willing to talk about it with you and those who are listening. We don't really like to open ourselves up, especially in a forum like this, where there's a possibility of secondary abuse, or just mean comments in that sense. And it does take a great amount of courage to want to talk about private things, because people sometimes don't understand or they pass judgment. So I hope that you and your listeners can approach this discussion with this in mind and treat me as you would like a Buddhist or someone of another religion showing what they believe. I have actually found that people seem to not criticize in that manner when it's another religion. But I have found that the pain of leaving the church it creates a wall between those who leave and those who still believe, even if the believers are not judging them for leaving. And I have family members and close friends that have left the church, and even though I didn't change, they approach me as if I now judge them, which I want everyone to understand that that's not the case. But it does change your relationship, which is hard, and that's never what I have wanted. So just with that understanding, I hope that can be respected or understood. But my goal, like you said, is not to convince you or any of your listeners of my beliefs, but to participate in a safe place where we can talk civilly and respectfully and understand both sides. And as I told you, I've actually been researching both sides. I don't just research everything that is positive about the church. Frankly, I don't want to live in an echo chamber, and it doesn't help me to develop why I believe what I do. So, and ultimately we see things based on our own life experiences, and we come with certain biases, and you certainly will see the biases that I have, because that's kind of how I base my argument. But it's not necessarily a bad thing as long as we acknowledge what those biases are.
Excellent. All right.
And I have watched some of your videos, and some of the conclusions that you have come to, I agree with, absolutely. And others, I don't think there's enough evidence to come to the conclusion that you've made. And this is one of the videos that I think that I can provide a little bit more evidence.
All right. So where does that start?
Framing the argument, I think, is important. Okay. So I'm going to be arguing this based on the understanding that I personally believe in Heavenly Father and Mother. I personally believe in Jesus Christ and Holy Spirit, and I also believe in Satan. I believe in the Book of Mormon, and I also believe in things that most people don't see, which actually comes into play a lot when we're talking about Joseph Smith.
Okay.
So I think that's an important place to frame. Also,
so you're talking about the premises that you bring to the discussion, things that you are accepting before we even go to the details of Joseph Smith.
Right. And I'm going to talk a little bit about my life history so that can help provide some context in the conclusions that I have made. All right. So, and also I think it's important to frame it that Joseph Smith also has, he believed in divine command, clearly, and that in order to prove that his intentions, I mean, if we don't understand that, then any of his intentions can't be proven any other way, really. It just doesn't make any sense if we don't
When you say
understand.
divine command, what do you mean when you say Joseph Smith believed in divine command?
Believing that whatever God says is right.
Okay.
So that's what divine command is.
And
So
this is something I covered in a video where I called it divine command morality, where morality is defined by what God permits or allows. And
right,
that may
right.
be one thing in one context and a different thing in a different context.
That's right.
Okay.
And so yeah, the Bible is fraught with that.
Yeah.
It's a challenge. Okay, and
Okay.
let's see. So I'm just gonna. So also, if we understand that Joseph Smith actually believed what he taught, if we go with that premise, things will be understood differently than if he was just a charlatan completely, which is a totally different argument. So I'll just start with my background, if that sounds good.
Okay. Yeah, please do.
Okay. All right. So I'm willing to deconstruct your argument regarding Joseph Smith and the idea that he was a sexual predator, and I'll walk that path with you for a little bit by talking about my own childhood.
Okay.
I always believed that the church was an appendage to my relationship with Heavenly Father and the Savior. It has never been the reason for my relationship with them. And I can remember as a very, very young girl that I would look up into heaven and have a connection, knowing that the family that I was with at the time, I'm talking like 3 or 4, very, very
Okay.
young, that I knew that I had a Heavenly Father and a Savior. This was before I ever was taught anything in primary or anything like that. I believe that it was a gift given to me based on the fact that I would have to then endure a lot of abuse. But so I had that connection outside of the church always. And as I look back now, I look at the church and I think, this is the best religion to describe what I already experienced in my life. Does that make sense?
You came to your approach to God being a very individual and personal one, and the church was
Mm-hmm.
just a vehicle to support that relationship. And
Right.
as you look now at the religious landscape of other churches and everything, you see the church as being the closest organization, the truest to that purpose, to that relationship. And that's how you
Yeah.
approach it. Does
That's
that sound
exactly
right?
right.
Okay.
And so because I've had that always growing up, I've always had a very different perspective on what people are doing. I grew up in the President Benson era.
Mm.
So very, very specifically directed. I don't know when you grew up, if you were in that same era, what your age was, but that was when I was about teenager and early marriage time.
Hmm.
And so it influenced the way I thought a lot
Yeah.
about the direction I would take. Being a stay-at-home mom, very, very important to me. But I already wanted to be a stay-at-home mom, so that was more of a support
Right.
to what I already felt like.
It was an affirmation of your own perspective,
Exactly. It was an
knowing that that
affirmation.
was in alignment with God's purposes and the way that you could best serve God's purposes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so but I look back and I think, yeah, I'm really glad that that's what I chose to do. I have 6 children and have devoted most of my time doing that, which,
Okay.
has a lot of it's, raising kids. It's crazy.
Yeah.
But there was none of the information that is out now that was taught back then. I mean, with the gospel topic essays, that just wasn't out there. It was really hard. We didn't really have internet and all this stuff available. I would have studied this back then if I had that information, which I think a lot of people would have. And so I actually have been deconstructing my beliefs in the church for about 30 years, but have just barely been able to come across some of the information. So I feel like I'm so far behind trying to catch up, trying to figure out what is, and some things I find out are like, wow, okay, that's actually cool. And other things I'm just, torn apart with. But I have a polygamous background on both sides.
Hmm.
So my mom's side, her memories of her two grandmothers at family reunions and things of that nature. I would talk to with my mom about that, and she said it was wonderful that everybody loved each other, everything was great. Well, I personally, as you'll come to understand, can't wrap my head around that one. So she would only talk about positive things about polygamy. Now my great grandfather only had two wives, and that was my mom's side. On the other side, in fact, my mom said, yeah, if I had to live polygamy, I would be fine with it. I don't agree, but that's fine. On my dad's side, though, and I'm going to tell the name, which is fine. My dad's side, his grandfather, Thomas Max Chamberlain, he has a very different story. And this is where I feel like the pain of polygamy has influenced me in my life. As a child, he was a child of a polygamist mother who was married to a man who was very abusive. This man ended up taking all of Thomas's mom's possessions, ended up leaving them destitute, very abusive physically to Thomas, and he vowed that he would never participate in polygamy. He said, if this is what polygamy is, and I'm telling you this story because we have this big, huge, thick book about his history, which is so nice to have. So he did not ever want to be a polygamist. And as he got older, he received a patriarchal blessing, which we as church members do put emphasis on what is said in our patriarchal blessings. And it told him that he would be a polygamist. And when he was told that, he really, really struggled because of his past experience. He didn't want to participate.
Wow.
So with that understanding, I have
what year would that patriarchal blessing have come? Do you recall off the top of your head?
I don't know the year, but I'll give you a time frame. So Brigham Young told, as he got older, he was a polygamist, and he was told by Brigham Young to establish Orderville, which is right out of Kanab. I don't know if you are aware of that, but so in this area, he was told to do that. He ended up with 6 wives and 55 children, which was huge. But each of those wives, they each had their own industry. And they each had their own homes. And so it was set up very specifically. And they actually talk about the ins and outs of living the United Order. But my personal feeling about that has always been one of anger and judgment. And I'll tell you how I feel about polygamy.
Okay, so just so that we frame the discussion and make sure that I have little segments here, you've talked about the premises you bring to the discussion in terms of believing in the reality of God and Heavenly Father, the acceptance beforehand that Joseph Smith accepts as real divine command morality, and then you give us a little bit of background about yourself and your feeling that the primacy of your relationship with God is at the center of your spiritual worldview, and the church is an appendage or a support of that, and that you have a personal background with polygamy, with family members that would see it both in a positive as well as a negative light. And now you're going to talk a little bit about your own perspective about polygamy. Does that frame what we've talked about? All right.
Yes.
Okay.
Can you hear me? You're kind of cutting out a little bit.
Yes, I can.
Okay. Perfect. So that's exactly perfect. I'm at the point now to discuss why I've these feelings about polygamy.
Okay.
I was very abused growing up. My father was sexually abusive. He sexually molested all 4 of us girls, and I'm going to talk more detail about that. Not of course terrible detail, but details that are pertinent to this argument. So when I was very, very young, I remember a very early age, about 3 years old, is when I first remember this happening. My parents became separated I was 6 years old. And after that, my mother got remarried 2 years later to an extremely physically, emotionally, and psychologically abusive man, my stepfather, who was also a scriptorian. And so I have experienced all kinds, excuse me, of abuse growing up. And in order to heal from that abuse, I have spent years and years studying, going to therapy, learning all about behaviors, how it starts, what it looks like, um, and the repercussions of what happens when you have been abused, and also sex addiction, period. My father was a sex addict, and he went on, as I'll tell you in more detail later, what happens when you're a sex addict and he was a predator. And so there are differences between people who are sexual addicts versus those who are predators, which really gives me the background for this argument.
Okay.
So there was always this question in my mind, is there ever a time when polygamy is a good thing? Is there a possibility that there are times in history that polygamy has been commanded by God? And if there is, could we define what that looked like? And also, if it's just polygamy, I mean, if polygamy plays a big part of the argument that Joseph was a sexual predator, then I look at that differently, because there, of course, are polygamists who aren't sexual predators. And I've listened to some of your YouTube videos, and I know that you have other arguments as well.
Sure.
But I've seen, both sides of polygamy. There is actually no evidence that my great-grandfather, who is Thomas Chamberlain, there's no evidence that he was ever abusive to his wives, and yet he had 6 wives and 55 children, which I think is crazy. That's a lot of kids. So anyway, but with my father having been an abuser and then going on to experience other abuse, there are certain things that you experience as an abuse victim, and indications of abuse. So you, just really quick, some of your videos, you give details about the happiness letter and cult leaders that use sex to control their followers, and the persuasive tactics that they use. And so these persuasive tactics, I have a degree in communication, and one of the things that I studied was persuasion. And so what I've been able to break down is these persuasive tactics that are pointed out that were used by Joseph Smith are also used by people who are not accused of being sexual predators. And so I was looking at your argument and the way it is constructed. So I was deconstructing your argument.
Okay.
And so I just want to make sure that this is how you wanted to present it. And I'm just going to really simplify it. So if Joseph Smith used persuasive tactics that could be considered manipulative to get women to marry him, and if sexual predators use these same tactics to sexually abuse and take advantage or control their victims, then Joseph Smith is a sexual predator. Would that be along the lines of what your argument is?
Okay, so state that again so I can make sure I understand.
Okay, sure. And of course, it's totally oversimplified. But
No,
if
that's okay.
Joseph Smith used persuasive tactics that could be considered manipulative and controlling to get women to marry him, if he did that, and if sexual predators use these same tactics to sexually abuse, take advantage, or control their victims, then Joseph Smith is a sexual predator. Would that be true as far as how you base your argument?
Right. I think that the way that I framed it, and I hope I provided enough examples, is that an isolated example is a data point that can lead or suggest one conclusion. And you have to have some skepticism about that because there are other possibilities. But when you take that data point in the context of multiple additional data points, which all would support the same argument, then if a pattern develops which is indistinguishable from a sexual predator and how other people we'd identify as sexual predators, then we have to either provide an explanation which explains that, or accept the possibility that if we're going to use one tool set to identify a sexual predator in a clearly defined group, and if that same tool set would also identify Joseph Smith as a sexual predator, then we have to respect that. I think what you've articulated here in terms of if Joseph Smith uses tactic A and a sexual predator uses tactic A, then it means Joseph Smith is a sexual predator. I think that there are examples where you could use that paradigm and have it not be true. So if Joseph Smith lied to someone and a sexual predator lies to someone, does that mean Joseph Smith is a sexual predator? No, because there are people who lie to people about, money, and they may be a predator financially, but they're not predator sexually. And so I guess, does that explain how there may be differences or a little bit more? Okay.
That's exactly right. And so what I wanted to bring to the table is if Joseph Smith is a sexual predator, all sexual predators are sex addicts. Now, not all sex addicts are sexual predators, but all sexual predators are sex addicts. And that's what I would like to deconstruct, is what sexual addiction looks like. And there's lots of ways to tell that.
Okay. So that I understand this clearly. Are you starting this with starting with the assumption that my perspective is that Joseph Smith was a sexual addict and that was part of the dynamic of his sexual predator features? Or are you saying that sexual predators are a subset of people who are sexual addicts, and then we're going to look at that particular subset? Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So in order to be a sexual predator, you have to have sexual addiction.
And do you have a working definition for how you look at sexual addiction? Because I know there's some controversy in the realm of people who study sexologists, I guess, about what would constitute sexual addiction if it was real.
Yeah, actually, the DSM manual has removed hypersexualism, which is kind of, it's really hard for people like me who have dealt with sex addicts in their lives, because it pretty much says that it's not a problem. And so the DSM manual, the 5th edition, has actually removed that out of there. But my experience with the destruction that happens with someone with these behaviors, it is actually far better to describe this as an addiction. It's kind of like what looks and walks like one, because you can overlay any of these behaviors onto another addiction, which is readily accepted as in society, like alcoholism or cocaine addiction or anything like that. You can overlay these same behaviors, and they overlay perfectly.
For the purpose of this discussion, how would you like to frame just the concept of sexual addiction so that we can understand what you're talking about beyond that?
Perfect. That's exactly what I'm going to go into. Okay. So sexual addiction, in all of the therapies and things that I have been involved in, I dealt with, like I said, my father, who was a predator. I also have dealt with 3 other sex addicts, close family members. So it is something that is very prevalent, and I have a lot of experience dealing with them. And so what I'd like to describe as sex addiction is someone who has no control or lack of control or restraint concerning their sexual thoughts and urges and behaviors. It is marked. I'm reading you just from an article that I have, and I can actually give that to you later, but there's tons and tons of stuff out there. Anybody can Google it. But it is marked by compulsive sexual thoughts and acts with difficulties with intimacy. It is uncontrollable compulsions with pornography. And I don't know if you can say this word, but I'll say the M word. I don't know if that's...
No, we can say it. There's no... Yeah, okay. I think naming something appropriately contributes to the discussion.
Perfect. So if we can say that, then compulsions with pornography and masturbation, phone sex, cyber sex, escorts, prostitutes, meaningless affairs, strip clubs, voyeurism, and exhibitionism, to name a few Those are things that, and we're just going to say that sex addiction exists. Those are things that sex addicts participate in, and they find that they cannot control that.
Okay,
And
so
in
just
some,
to be clear then, that your perspective on this sexual addiction definition is informed by your own experiences, and it sounds like you hinted a little bit that you've met with therapists who endorse this paradigm, and that informs
Mhm.
your view on it. Is that correct?
Yes, we've
Okay.
been through therapy, also just a lot of research. And
And
this
is
was
that inside and outside of LDS family therapists or LDS
yes,
therapists? So
yes.
this has been
Hmm.
not just Mormon therapists, but also therapists who deal with issues of sexuality and abuse who have no connection to the Mormon Church or Mormon theology or anything like
Right.
that.
This
Okay.
actually, this article is not from the Mormon Church that I have right now. It's actually from, I think, another religious group. They are religious, so just that is a bias, because I know
Okay.
that some doctors say, like I said, that there is no such thing, or that it's really perpetuated by religion.
Hmm.
Um, but I have found that shame is not perpetuated by religion, that people feel shame whether they're religious or not,
Hmm.
depending on how they, you know, what their feelings are regarding their actions. But in some cases, this can progress to rape or pedophilia.
Okay,
And
so to be clear, this is definitely going to be a controversial part of what you're
mhm,
laying out here because there are so many disagreements about the nature and reality of sexual addiction. I've already got somebody calling in, but we're just going to make sure that you have a chance to go from here to where
mhm.
you're trying to go. What now that you've laid out what you see as a definition for sexual addiction, bring us into the world of Joseph Smith and how you go from here.
Okay, so signs of sexual addiction, like I was reading, as I was looking and studying the various things of Joseph Smith, there would be indications of this addiction aside from, let me get down here. Aside from him procuring women as wives. Um, let's say that uh, he is a sex addict. Okay, so we're going to be looking for these behaviors of a sex addict. There is no indication that he has any kind of deviant sexual behavior. For example, excessive masturbation. There's no documentation of something of that nature. Um, there's nothing that says that he was involved in pornography at the time, which I don't know how that would. I don't know how prevalent that would be, or soliciting prostitutes or anything outside the bonds of marriage, according to his understanding. And that to me is very important. And the reason why is because living with my father, who was a predator, he not only engaged in excessive pornography use, masturbation, and pedophilia, but it progressed. And that progression is indicative of an addiction. And this progression happened with part of my siblings as well as people outside our home. So, for example, just the molestation progressed to rape, and then other women that I am aware of, and my siblings' friends were involved, which even to this day I don't know how many people were affected. Also, it transferred not just from the girls, but also there's indication that when my father went out, he married another family,
Hmm.
and there's indications that he was either molesting or introducing pornography and masturbation to my stepbrother. Um, and so it's it's important to understand the digression and how things happen. And as I've researched Joseph Smith, there's no indication or any documentation saying that he was suffering from any of these things. Um, and there's a lot of contradictions regarding what I have come across that a sex addict or a predator would
Hmm.
act like, versus someone who is just living inside the belief system that I outlined at the beginning. So with that understanding of just my father, we haven't even come into the the details of the cult leaders,
Okay,
which I
so
actually
that I
have
can
studied.
I want to make sure I understand what you just articulated because I think it's one of the central pillars of your argument. And that is, if we start with the premise that anyone who is at the point where they're a sexual predator has gotten to that point by also having or preceding that point with being a sexual addict, and that people who are sexual addicts have signs of that addiction in their life that that aren't the exact act of being a predator, but are ancillary to it, and that can include compulsive, uncontrollable, and escalating experiences with masturbation and some of the other sexual things that you've identified here. And since the historical record does not have Joseph Smith in your study and your perspective of Joseph Smith, the historical record does not have him having any of these hallmarks of sexual addiction, then the idea that he was a sexual predator without having the background of this sexual addiction is less likely or less consistent than the things that you outlined at the beginning, which are the reality of God, the reality of Joseph Smith as the prophet, and the reality of divine command morality, in that he was commanded to enter into these marriages that we would see as unorthodox, but it wasn't for sexual gratification or out of sexual addiction or predation, but out of obeying God's commands. Does that summarize
I would
it?
say that that is a simplistic summary. It's always more complex than that. Okay. Of course, neither one of us can prove what Joseph's intentions were. Unfortunately, because sex addiction, a lot of it is intention based. And when you go to therapy, you kind of unravel that in your brain so that you can understand the addiction better. That's actually a process that you have to do, what your intentions are, what the cycles are. And because really a lot of the addiction is fought internally. And so because we don't have the ability to go inside Joseph Smith's head and know exactly what he was thinking, we can only base our argument on the behaviors that we see. And there are very specific behaviors that manifest themselves with an addict. Even the understanding that addiction can be created at any point. It doesn't matter how old you are. You can become a sex addict later on in life if you are, in that propensity. And so with that understanding, the possibility that, okay, maybe Joseph Smith started out with the wives and being obedient, and then he possibly progressed. There is still even the understanding that progression can happen very, very quickly, and deviance can happen very quickly. And so there still is no evidence to say that even if he started to become a sex addict, there's still no indication that he was to the point of being a predator. There really has to be more information. And so basically we are dealing with stuff that just...
Okay, Xena, we may have lost your signal because you cut out. Hello, can you hear me? Hello, hello. All right, well, if you can hear this, just try disconnecting and reconnecting, and we'll add you back into the conversation when that happens. So in the meantime, this has been an interesting discussion where we're laying out additional dynamics that have to do with sexuality and with the way that you may examine these people. I think it's interesting when you talk about the way that she's approaching an examination of Joseph Smith. If you then go and examine some of these other group leaders, you'd have to ask some of the same questions of, were there signs that there was a sexual addiction, even preceding some of the sexual predations. It's a interesting perspective that is difficult, I think. Okay, hold on. We got her back.
All right.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, sorry about that.
No, that's all right.
Okay, so I don't know where I left off. I think just that we lack a lot of that information and proof that would need to occur and be prevalent in order to make that conclusion. But also the contradictions that were fraught with, especially when you compare the other cult leaders, which you had described and brought up in your video. I don't have a fetish about it, but I have always had curiosity about cult leaders. So I was aware of all of these cult leaders. In fact, I remember when David Koresh and that whole compound went down.
Yeah, that was
I was
pretty
watching
center
that.
in the national news and everything at the
Exactly.
time. Even as a kid, I
Exactly.
remember that.
Right. And so I watched that. I was aware of it. I knew what he was saying and doing to control the women. And then, of course, Warren Jeffs. I just recently have been studying up on him. We It's so great with all the information out there now. I've been watching Escape from Polygamy, which goes right along with how I feel. It's like, yes. But when you consider the details about Warren Jeffs, and I'm just going to focus on him for a minute because he's really easy and there's a lot of information about him. Warren Jeffs' situation, he uses and says all the same things that Joseph Smith or even just leaders of the church have said. And so I sat there thinking, wait a second, these are all the same things I've heard. In fact, the people that are escaping from polygamy, they say all the same things. I'm just thinking, wow, this is, I've heard the same, they bear their testimony the same, they do all this stuff, but is there a difference? And so I started to dissect that. So with Warren Jeffs, he has all the indications of a sex addict. He is, there were several different documentaries that have come out, and one of them was by his nephew, Brent Jeffs. And any of your listeners can go and watch this. It's pretty profound and very heart-wrenching. But apparently Brent was raped by him as well as his two older brothers. So with Warren Jeffs, we don't just have wives that he is procuring. We do have pedophilia and also with both genders. So it is not gender specific. Now this is kind of an awful detail, but since Warren Jeffs has been arrested, there was an interview given to one of Warren Jeffs' guards, and he described his addiction to masturbation. And in prison, apparently, he has a really high problem with masturbation 15 plus times a day. That is an indication of a sex addict. There is no controlling it. Now, obviously, he is far down on the progression that we're dealing with here. Very far, but it is a really good illustrator of what sex addicts' behaviors look like and how they can digress to that if nothing is done to curtail or stop or heal, remediate that behavior. So if you compare that to, and the other cult leaders have a lot of the similar behaviors. If you compare that to the lack of evidence of that with Joseph Smith, that is a very important argument to understand that is not indicative of, Warren Jeffs' behavior is indicative of an addict, whereas the lack of evidence is not indicative of a predator when we're talking about Joseph Smith. So if that is one of the things that is very important. And I don't know if there's anybody who wants to make a comment on that, but I was about to transition to another aspect of it.
I think some of the comments that may come in if we opened up to a discussion on this particular point would be, given that the social mores exist now that possibly existed back then around issues of sexuality, do we have any evidence of documentation of anyone back in Joseph Smith's time engaging in masturbation multiple times a day? And do we have a sense of how rare or common that is? I think one of the criticisms that exists, for example, of the miracle of forgiveness and Spencer W. Kimball's perspective articulated in that book that masturbation will lead to the sin of homosexuality is that people who study sex and human sexuality will say that masturbation itself is so ubiquitous that you can't do any research and have a negative control arm because it is just common. People just keep it secret and private and hide it and don't make it a public issue. And that's, saying that it's common is different from saying that there are no pathological manifestations like you're talking about of Warren Jeffs in jail 15 times a day. There's clearly, when you're sacrificing other parts of your life for it, a pathological dimension to it. But if you don't have the data point that everybody who is experiencing maturation in human sexuality will have engaged in masturbation at some point, then somebody who has adopted the mindset that, and this is the argument that some people make, is that Spencer W. Kimball himself may have been homosexual because he experienced the impulse of masturbation and then also had homosexual thoughts and ideas. And so he created a causal relationship between those two in his mind, because he didn't have a broader perspective to understand that everybody experiences sexual thoughts and experimentation with masturbation as part of the normal human sexual development cycle. And so that's where misinformation and a limited perspective can lead to erroneous conclusions. I don't know if that's, I guess the point that I'm making here is that if we assume that masturbation was as prevalent in the 1800s as it is today, then if we don't have evidence that anybody else engaged in masturbation because it wasn't something that people wrote about or spoke publicly about, then it would not be surprising that even if someone had a pathological problem about it, there's no documentation about it.
Right. And that's actually a really good way to state it, because we don't have evidence. But the argument is, because we don't have evidence, that means that we can't come to any conclusion on that. And
Okay.
basically, there's just a lot of missing evidence. And then there's also evidence to the contrary, that it would not be the case. And we can go into that in a little bit. But as far as the cult leaders and things of that nature and sex addiction, the outcome that we see of these cults are also an important indication of what type of abuse went on with these people and how they are trying to escape. And that is actually a perfect segue into the next thing that I was going to talk about, which is the wives of Joseph Smith. Now, these women, they didn't grow up in the church. And so, because the church was just being established, so they were not necessarily indoctrinated at a young age by these particular religious ideas that Joseph was presenting. Now, we do have a history that they were moral women and that they had a moral standard. And, it's important to recognize that. But as far as indoctrination that happens with a predator, that's not present with these women that Joseph is asking, to marry. And because they're the first generation of polygamous wives, it would be much harder to accept than if they were, let's say, in the Kingston group or the FLDS church, where they grew up not knowing anything else. So understanding that predators are much more successful with younger children before they know right and wrong and have formed opinions about life and formed their personalities, that is an important thing to understand, that these women, first of all, there are a couple of them that are young. Absolutely, in our standards and my standard. And I want to refer back to the understanding that I have my own issues with polygamy, just to remind everybody I have a really hard time I've had to overcome, just not being full out angry. But if you take these things into consideration and understand that these women, they weren't all young. A lot of them were in their 20s and 30s. And some of them were not in sexual relations with Joseph. And so to look at all of them and to say that every one of them were either brainwashed or coerced in a way, it actually takes away from any kind of intelligence that they would have had. I really feel like they came with personalities, and I think it paints these women as kind of foolish or very easily swayed, I should say. And if they had truly had undue influence or power over them, that there had to at least been one of them that came out of Joseph Smith's influence or trance or whatever you want to say, that they were under. And I don't know of any stories where they had been married to him and they say, I had to escape from perverted treatment, or, escape from Joseph's ideology that is so oppressive, or anything that would be indicative of kind of sexual oppression that happens in a sexually abusive environment. So there really is nothing to indicate that, as contrasted with, of course, the other women that escape from polygamy in these other groups and that have shows that I've been watching. It's just a very, very different atmosphere. And also the other thing is when Joseph died, a lot of these women were then sealed to Brigham or other people. And if they really had an aversion or thought that, this is not making me happy to a degree where I feel like it is wrong, that would have been a really good time for them to get out. I don't see that was happening. Is there any indication in history that was happening at all?
Is there any indication that women wanted to get out of polygamy, or only
Right.
women who were tied to Joseph wanted to get out of polygamy?
Just the women tied to Joseph, because we're just trying to establish his character as far as being a sex addict or using sex as control.
Well, the way that I usually see it framed from Brian Hales, for example, is that there were no complaints from any of the women. But what that ends up doing is creating an exclusion category where if there were women who rejected his proposals from the beginning, we don't even consider those women. And they're not counted among the critics of Joseph Smith. And go ahead.
Go ahead. I was just going to say this.
I'll let you go.
Go ahead. Okay, I'll go. Yeah, and that in itself is problematic, because that just brings us back to the point that there just is not enough information to decide either way. And a lot of times, if you're in an abusive situation, you don't come out anyway. And women were not heard of. And so there is that problem.
No, I agree. And I think as I'm listening to the way that you're describing these things, a couple of things are coming to mind. Just in terms of whether or not somebody is indoctrinated from being a child versus indoctrinated as an adult. I think looking at various other groups, you can see that there are certainly indoctrination of children is a special category, because you're shaping their entire world conception from the beginning in the religious framework and paradigm that exists, that they then inhabit, versus somebody who goes from not being under the spell of a religious charlatan to going into the realm where their worldview is now shaped by the doctrine of the group. And there are instances of adults who become just as indoctrinated and submit to things that they would previously held as immoral because of the teachings of an individual, even though they didn't grow up in childhood with them. And this can include taking some very extreme measures. When you look at the Heaven's Gate group, many of those people were actually college-educated, highly educated people who worked with Marshall Applewhite and adopted his metaphysical universe and then acted on it. And in his case, it wasn't about him indulging sexually with his members, but the psychodynamics of his own denial of his own sexuality that was then infused into his doctrine, so that many of the members followed his example in castrating themselves. And the purpose of, just going into this part of the discussion is just to show that there can be grown-up, educated people who aren't born into a false system of belief, who subordinate their own will, their own bodies to the demands of that belief. And that can be things in the sexual realm as well as things outside of the sexual realm. And so that's one thing that I feel like we learn from these other groups that may diminish the case that you're making about that there are no grown-up women who seem to have rejected Joseph Smith. The other dimension to that is that Joseph Smith's most productive time on the issue of polygamy spans only a handful of years. And if you look at some of these other groups, the one that's coming to my mind is there's a documentary series that covers a pastor named Tony Alamo. And Tony Alamo's religious, I think I lost you, Xena, but let's see if you get the thing, just reconnect. But Tony Alamo's religious paradigm was that the Bible gave him a religious framework to have multiple brides, including underage girls. And so if you just look at the snapshot when he is at the most active in his teaching and practice of this polygamy framework, you see that the women are involved, they are interested, and they are accepting of those teachings. Let me just add Xena back in.
Okay,
Hey, Xena.
sorry about
Sorry
that.
about that.
Yeah,
That's okay.
so you're
So,
exactly right, and so that's the problem is we do have in we do have a lot of cases where there are adults, but what I would like to propose is that it would just be harder, especially in the fact that the way Joseph approached it, it would be a lot harder. He didn't approach it in what I would consider a traditional cult way, which
okay.
would be to indoctrinate quickly, gain control quickly, without allowing the victim to have time to actually really think or ponder about the decision that they were going to make.
I would push back a little bit on that perspective, just given the account of some of the women who later would testify about their experience on it. If we accept their testimony as legitimate, there was one of them who said that Joseph issued his proposal, and then there was a sense of urgency where he said, if you don't accept it, the gate will be forever shut to you. And it was that dynamic of urgency in that one proposal that that I think may be different from what you're talking about, was not present in other proposals. But yeah, I don't want to get into the debating every point about what you're having, because I want to make sure that you've had a chance to lay out your entire perspective on this. So the point that we're on right now is, if I understand you correctly, is that there are patterns that you would see in other things that are clearly religious manipulation and sexual predation, having to do with just, every single instance is with this sense of urgency. You've got to accept now, or your spirit's in jeopardy, or something like that. How else would you frame some of the things you're talking about right now?
Okay, so to frame that, or to kind of address that, that could go either way. That could be something that could be used as a control tactic. It could also
Okay.
be a belief that Joseph actually did receive that information, and that is where the problem arises. And it's a problem that we both deal with, because you deal with it on one end, we deal with it on the other, and that's where it's really hard to prove either way what the intentions were, what his experiences are, and so being present in that specific situation, but not necessarily having proof in other situations, as well as having proofs of the women saying that, there are several of them that said that they did pray and they did have time to ponder. In fact, they actually wrestled with it and fought within themselves, but then came to the understanding. I think that is important to be noted. And
I do want to respond to that point, because that's one that I think you're not alone in articulating. Brian Hales has made this point as well. And there's a documentary called Waco that was the first time I was introduced to this. I guess it was the second time that I was introduced to other examples where women had been given this proposal of entering into a sexual relationship that was unorthodox and against their traditional morals. And it was put on them to decide for themselves, and then they claimed to have a revelation to themselves, which made it okay. And that was when you read the story of David Koresh's first plural wife. It was like the younger sister of his first wife. And the older sister really struggled with it because she didn't want her younger sister to be involved in it. And then she claims that she had a revelation, that God and the heavens were open to her, and she was told that that was fulfilling God's purposes. And that's one example. And then another example is in the Wayne Bent scenario, if you've seen the End of the World cult documentary, where Wayne Bent, as an offshoot of the Seventh-day Adventists, puts himself out as a prophet figure, and then plants the seed that he is supposed to consummate with the wife of his son, with his daughter-in-law. And she, at one point in the interview, the documentarian is actually filming her, and she's describing how she herself received a revelation that it was right and it was of God and it was what was supposed to happen. And so those are two examples that I see in other groups that are not connected to Joseph Smith, where a religious leader, and this speaks again to that persuasion, some of those techniques of persuasion. I don't have to convince you on the force of my argument. I can plant seeds and tell you, I'm not going to tell you what to do. It's up to you to decide. But if they're making that decision in a context where they accept beforehand some of the things, like, for example, if they have accepted divine command morality for their profit, then there's a great deal of psychological and religious pressure on their minds to have a revelation that would make that prophet's instructions be okay with God. And so we have examples of other women in other paradigms receiving revelations themselves to make the requests of their religious charlatan leaders okay.
Yes, I actually watched that documentary. I know exactly what you're talking about.
Okay.
And so I would, that is a very gray area, especially since we can't look at every single one of the women with Joseph Smith and know exactly what their mental state was, or what it was that they thought, the process that they went through.
The story that really comes to mind on that issue is the wife of Heber Kimball, actually. There's this amazing story depicted in a biography that was written by one of their descendants, where Joseph allows Heber Kimball to take another wife, or instructs him to, and he really struggles over it because it's really against his disposition. And
Right.
his wife sees that he's struggling with it, and then it seems almost unprompted, comes to him, Violet Kimball does, with a revelation that she understands, she knows what it's about, and she's okay with it, and that it will add to her, their glory and his glory. And so that was kind of like, that's the paradigm that I saw in the Mormon context of it.
Yeah. And so we see these same actions, these same behaviors on either side, whether it's in a cult or in the situation with Violet Kimball, as well as Eliza R. Snow, and the way that they came to their own understanding. My concern is that we are at risk of putting that blanket understanding of how a cult would persuade women on all of the women that Joseph married, including the ones that were married and he was sealed to. And I think we just need to be very careful not to do that these women are all very individual, very different ages, very different backgrounds, very different life circumstances, and which I find to be, let's say, comparing to Warren Jeff's situation, all of these children that he indoctrinated were all under the same circumstances. Very easy to see how that happened with them. It is very difficult to see how that would happen with women of such diverse backgrounds in history. So I just think that it's another position that it's inconclusive to me. It's not conclusive. There's just many things that contradict. I do see similarities, though, in the cult. I totally understand that and see that.
Well, there's something, because you're new to my channel, you probably don't know this, but I really hesitate to use the word cult when I can avoid it. And that is primarily because there's no real clear definition of the word cult, and it's such a loaded word that people on either side of an issue can either use to whatever end. And so when I talk about these things, if you watch some of the other videos, I talk about manipulative messages and methods of undue influence and psychological manipulation. Okay. And so the cult is really defined by the use of these types of manipulation. And so any group, like I was in the military for a period of time, and there are aspects of compelling people to do things in the military that you can define that cults use. And so it's kind of like, to what extent, and there are certain techniques that some groups use that others don't, and it's just the big picture of things that would define some group as using undue influence to compel members to do and believe things. That, we commonly see that as if it's somebody else's group, it's a cult, but if it's my group, it's not. And so,
Right.
so
I
I
can
think
see
I
how
see
that,
it. Yeah. So
yeah.
if you say, well, we're not like these cult leaders. Well, I don't. It's harder for the way that I do it, because the thing that defines the cult is the use of certain types of manipulation. And so if you say, well, we're using a similar type of manipulation, but we're not like the cult leader, but if the cult leader is defined by the use of that manipulation, it's a problem. But that's where the divine command caveat, I think, comes into play, in that if somebody who wasn't actually given a divine command uses this message, then it's manipulative and it's wrong. But if somebody was actually given a command from God to do it, then even though we may see it as wrong in another context, it's right in this context.
Yeah. And that is, of course, fraught with difficulties in itself.
Yeah.
But that goes back to anybody who does believe in the Bible and anybody who does believe in the Book of Mormon. And I find that these persuasive tactics that are used with religious leaders of undue influence, is that appropriate?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. That
And
these
you can use the
tactics.
word cult. We know what you're understanding about, and
Okay.
so you just won't
Okay.
hear me use it as freely, probably.
Okay. So these tactics are, if they stand alone, they, depending on the situation, which I
Mhm.
agree, like if my child is going to hurt themselves and run out into a street, I will use undue influence on that child. And there are certain circumstances that I believe as a parent that is very appropriate. And even down to a small thing like persuading them to eat healthy food versus unhealthy food. So even at the very basic things, if you use those persuasive techniques or tactics alone and you just let them sit alone, they themselves are not inherently evil or wrong. But it is when they are used for wrong purposes. And that's where the problem lies, is we can't prove that Joseph Smith and everything that he told his wives is true now that he has passed away and he is gone and he is with all of those wives, or not. Unfortunately, we can't prove that what he said was true in those circumstances, what he promised them. I can't prove that it's true. You can't prove that it's not. And so that's a dilemma. We can only try and have this conversation based on the information that we're given, which is very limited. And even if there are direct, like you say, if there's direct influence on a woman and she writes this in her journal, then you have to take that into consideration. So, it is fraught with difficulties. So as we try and establish this, though, we do have to understand that there are nefarious purposes with people. And a lot of times you can't really see how nefarious it was until years later. And as I look at some of these religious leaders who had nefarious purposes, you see the results of their entire community suffering. I do not believe that the entire community of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is suffering. I believe that these concepts that were taught by Joseph Smith have brought tremendous amount of good to not just the members, but also society, benefiting from the goodness of the people who strive to live these doctrines.
Doctrines,
Thank you.
yeah.
Doctrines, yes. So, but if you compare that to those who have nefarious purposes, is tremendous amount of pain that is just unprecedented, and death and entire annihilation, like in the Jim Jones situation. That is something that needs to be looked at as well, I believe, because I don't believe that it has not been my experience, let's say, where someone who is terribly corrupt at the core can even bring forth this amount of good fruit. For example, the pain and suffering that each one of my siblings have gone through because of the abuse of my father, you can't measure it. It has passed down from us to our children, to our children's children, until it is stopped, because addiction doesn't just stop on its own, and the repercussions of it doesn't just go away. It takes tremendous amount of effort. And so looking at the possibility that Joseph Smith was an addict, the repercussions of how the people would react and how they would feel, it wouldn't just go away. They would suffer from trauma.
Hmm.
depending on the level of how they were treated, and if they were objectified in the way that addicts objectify their source. And I was going to go into that a little bit because of there
Well,
are some
so
inconsistencies.
that we can make sure we're keeping up with a good time and we have a chance to respond to some of the audience. Um, how much more, we're at our hour mark now from kind of when things were turned over to you. Is there, how many
Mm-hmm.
more points do you want to lay out, or is there something that you can do as your conclusion laying out, and then maybe we can summarize things and then go
Yeah,
forward
sure.
to the next thing?
I just have a couple of things, and then I'll conclude.
Okay.
There's just the inconsistencies. I'll just go over a couple of them. I've already gone over most of them,
Mm-hmm.
but one of them is a limited time. And when a person is a sex addict and it is a problem in their life, which would then indicate that they would possibly be a predator, it takes time to be an addict, and it actually, over a person's life, they become more and more obsessed with the addiction unless they are striving to overcome it. And if that's the case, and if Joseph Smith was having problems with sex addiction and he was trying to overcome that, then it would actually make him an honorable person and not a predator. One of the other things is objectification of women, which is very painful. I mean, with my experience, a sex addict doesn't see the people they use for sexual gratification as people. They treat them as a means to an end, and their only purpose that they serve is for the addict's relief. And we're talking sexual abuse here. They're abused, and most women who would start out healthy would see and feel that they're being used. That I'm saying, if they're healthy, not indoctrinated or not abused as a young child, because that's different.
Mm-hmm.
But there is a big contrast in the women of the other religious groups of how they were treated versus how Joseph treated his wives. I am not aware of any of them that have written, like I said, about feelings about being used or anything of that nature, which may or may not have happened. But also, Joseph started the Relief Society, which is exactly the opposite of what a predator would do for his prey, to elevate the importance of womanhood. To elevate the importance of womanhood. I'm just reading this here. It would indicate that he felt women were worthy of status in the church. That's not what abusers do. They degrade. Let's see here. Just have a couple more points. They pull inward also. They tend to isolate themselves as the addiction becomes worse. And there's no indication of Joseph doing that. Pulling inward, he was always very extroverted, going out there, being involved in a lot of stuff. We're talking a lot of things that most people could never even think of.
I'm impressed by him.
Right. And then also the amount of children. I mean, that's really an issue. When you consider in my family, how he had 55 children.
Mm-hmm.
That's important to understand, because a sex addict is going to, let's say Joseph felt that it was important for him to only have sex within the bounds of marriage.
Mm-hmm.
If he's a sex addict, there would be indications that that's what he was doing. And there's no indication. There's just, I know that has been an argument as well for a long time, but it really is a real argument, especially when I have other instances, and Warren Jeffs, who had 79 wives and over 80 children.
Mm-hmm.
But these are just some of the contradictions. But in conclusion, I think Joseph Smith's behaviors, when they're looked at through the lens of a sex addict, they're fraught with inconsistencies. But on the other hand, if looked at through the lens of someone who believed in divine command, had been threatened by the Lord to have his translating ability taken away, or having been told to not fear man more than God, he was charismatic and with the abilities to persuade people, but full of mistakes and weaknesses, trying to organize a church, build a kingdom, whose intentions were misunderstood by the people, clearly, and the ones closest to him. And he was betrayed by his friends. He wanted people to understand him, and wanted them to be a part of what he was doing. I think that if you frame it with that his behaviors become consistent with that, because he's afraid to hurt people. He wants to persuade and please both man and God. I think in the instance with the Persuasion, like in the happiness letter,
Mm-hmm.
I think that that's possibly what he's doing. And also, my conclusion is that Joseph Smith was not a sexual predator. And I think it's an important one coming from the fact that I would have every reason to have a bias against Joseph because my relationship with God and Heavenly Father has always been separate from the church. And I would tend to be more angry and more accusatory to someone in this situation as I have come to heal throughout my life. I've had to kind of take a step back from that. So coming from that is my conclusion.
All right. Well, I thank you for taking the time to perhaps be a little bit vulnerable about your own background. And, that certainly gives a dimension to your perspective that is unique. I kind of wrote a few notes down about what I'm trying to identify as the main pillars of your perspective. The first one being that we're starting with the idea that if Joseph Smith was a sexual predator, then by definition he would also be a sexual addict, and we don't have an abundance of information that would lead to that conclusion, and some of his actions seem to contradict the notion of a sexual addict. If we assume and we take it as given that some of the things that he proposed, did, or taught, even if it was in secret, as some of the witnesses later revealed, they were done with in good faith as the manifestation of God's command to Joseph, including, and you are allowing for the idea that God would threaten him for not obeying that command, and that's the story that we see about the angel messenger who came with a drawn sword. And that Joseph struggled with his desire not to offend or hurt people, but also not to offend or disobey God. And so some of the things that we see in the narrative of his proposals that rub us the wrong way are the result of Joseph struggling with those two competing interests and trying to find a way forward. And then sort of on the positive argument side of things, we have what's called the good fruits argument. When you look at what Joseph produced, when you look at how polygamy was in the early church and the industry of the people, the happiness of the people, that it was a good fruit. And so even if we are uncomfortable with the details that we do know, there is enough stuff that we don't know that we can kind of, with faith, look at the good fruit that was produced and have confidence that Joseph acted in good faith. And I think, there's a lot more complexity that we've discussed in this, but does that kind of identify some of your main points?
Yes, but I do want to clarify. I
Sure.
do not believe that ends justify the means.
Okay.
That is not my approach at all. I myself wrestle with these details. I am
Okay.
not one-sided. So, and also the conclusion that I didn't add is that when there is a lack of evidence or unclear evidence, that we as ethical people would be important for us to then take the perspective that we side. We would side with. Sorry, let me gather my thoughts here. On the error of not having enough to be conclusive, then we would give that person the benefit of the doubt, which is what I have struggled with and have now learned in my own life to do. And that's what I would propose that we would do in this situation.
Okay. And I think that's a common refrain that we'll hear from church leaders is it's kind of the give Joseph a break thing. When there's some information we don't know about, it's okay to extend some grace to Joseph just because there are bits of data that we don't understand. And it's kind of like the character of the man in all the other contexts gives us reason to be able to trust him in this context as well. I don't know if that's reset. All right, so I have opened the lines, and if anyone would like to call and propose a question to Xena or myself about some of the things that we've discussed today, we can go through some of the comments and see if anyone has. I know somebody called earlier. If you want to call back now, they were calling around the time that we were talking about the concept of sexual addiction. I think this perspective where you're looking at the picture painted by critics of Joseph Smith as a sexual predator through the lens of, well, did he show the signs and symptoms of a sexual addict, is very interesting. It's not an approach that I've seen before. And it immediately raises the question of, well, we kind of know what a sexual addict looks like in the modern era. We can identify it. I think the people that subscribe to it identify it with certain behaviors. What did it look like back then? And I don't know the answer to that. Okay, so let's see here. Hello, you're on Talk on Things and Stuff. Can you hear me?
Yeah, John. How's it going, man?
I'm doing well. Thanks for calling. What's on your mind?
What's on my mind is I've just got a question for Xena. I know that with Joseph Smith, he gave a story of his reasonings to these women when he was courting them for marriage, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so you have two different accounts, one from a believing, member that, stayed within the church, and then you have accounts from those that didn't take his offer, and it's the same thing. An angel came with a flaming sword. I don't know, kind of wanted to hear, her thoughts on that. I don't know.
Okay, so you're asking specifically about the narrative that was not part of every proposal, but there certainly was one, possibly two, where one of the things that Joseph Smith brought to his persuasive argument was the idea that he was compelled to ask by an angel messenger with a flaming sword who was threatening him personally if he didn't obey. Does that sound like it? So there's a couple of dimensions to that, including concepts of free agency, if that's a violation of free agency, and so forth. Xena, how do you frame or put that aspect of the story into the perspective that you're talking about?
Well, that's really good because I actually have seen both sides of it. That's one that I wrestle with, of course, because being an abuse victim, I have been persuaded in ways that were very detrimental to me at an age where I couldn't, decide what is going to be right for me. I had no idea. When I think about these women who are a little bit older, like I said, in the perspective of the age does have some things to do with it.
Mm-hmm.
And there was one that I think, who was the happiness letter written for?
That was Nancy Reagan, age 19.
Okay, Nancy Reagan, thank you. Okay, so the fact that she turned Joseph down, I think is significant. I think it's awesome. Awesome in the way that she stood up for what she believed. I think that in the sense that Joseph would come to someone, it could be either way. It could be, yes, I'm going to try and control this person, or it could be, I'm in fear for this person's salvation. And because I have lived both paradigms, it's something that I can see both sides of. I can't come to any kind of conclusion because I don't know what his intentions were. There's no evidence. And truly, it looks nefarious if it's just taken at face value. Yeah. So that doesn't maybe help, but
there's a video that you probably haven't had a chance to see on my channel, Xena, because you have to dig a little bit into the past. It's called, embarrassingly enough, Drawn Swords and Blue Balls. And it just examines this phenomenon of people using the message that if you don't submit to what I'm requesting, then I'm going to be hurt. And it starts out with, the classic teenage boy thing of, come on, baby, I got blue balls or something like that. And that's like one of these, outside of a religious framework of, I'm going to be hurt if you don't submit to that. And so it appeals to the guilt, to the conscience of the person, not who you're trusting doesn't want to, hurt the other person. But then when you go into the religious realm, and this is where the Wayne Bent story applies as well, where he says that God is going to destroy him or bring him into a great deal of suffering. And then he actually, like, the camera's pointing at him, and this man claiming to be a prophet gets down on the ground. And he's like, I felt the pain and that God was going to come, and I knew that the consummation had to happen. And
I saw that.
Yeah, and then, that his daughter-in-law knew that the concept that he was going to be punished if this consummation didn't happen was one of the inputs that led to her having her own revelation that she was going to submit to it. And so I can definitely relate to, you're seeing both sides of it. You're seeing that, yeah, this is a tool that's used as manipulation, but if you approach it with the presumed assumption that Joseph Smith spoke in good faith, then you could see it as him trying to help the person out, so that they wouldn't, I guess, be guilty of being a part of causing the prophet pain or contributing to the prophet disobeying God. And it's one of those things where, because I'm at a position where I've let go of that presumed assumption that Joseph spoke in good faith, I find it much harder to take the good faith perspective. But I remember a time when that was the default perspective for me to take, and so I can relate to what you're talking about.
Right. And also as a member, I've taught all my children about choices, consequences, and where we want to go. I still believe that there is a heaven and that there is a hell. I still believe that. And I believe that I love Jordan Peterson, listen to him all the time.
Oh, yeah.
And he's agnostic, and he talks about that. And one of the things that he has said in one of his YouTube videos is that I don't know if there's a God, but I'm going to live my life as if there is, because the consequences of me not living my life that there's a God, and then I find out that there is a hell, then that basically that's his argument. So as I have questioned my own faith, I've actually come down to that. How would I live my life differently if I was not a member of the church? Would I live my life differently? And there would be very, very few changes that I would make.
Now, if we let's now just take the faithful perspective and look at this paradigm of the heavenly messenger with the sword. How do you square that with the notion of free agency with Joseph and these proposals? Have you proposed a rationale for that?
Well, I'm not aware of the women that he used this rationale with. Do you know specifically who they were and how old and at what time? And
yeah, this was. I think there were two different women. I forget. If I recall correctly, it was a woman in her young 20s. It wasn't one of the very, very youngest ones. But again, this you don't even have to know who the woman was. The concept was that he himself was under threat of the sword, not the women, but Joseph himself was. And so how does that play into free agency in terms of Joseph's own decision? Because I think the narrative that even Brian Hales has said is that Joseph was really, really a reluctant polygamist. That's actually the theme of one of the defenders of Joseph, Meg Stout. She wrote a book called The Reluctant Polygamist, and it's the idea is that Joseph really didn't want to do this, but then when an angel with a sword comes, now he had to choose between obeying this particular commandment and his own life and safety. So how do you rationalize that with free agency?
Okay, so this is more of a relationship with God situation, not necessarily him talking to the wife. Is that what you're saying?
Right.
Okay.
The person under threat was not the woman.
Okay.
The person under threat was Joseph for obeying the command to take multiple wives.
Right. And this has actually been a thing that I've thought of and studied through the Bible. It's just some of the hardest things that I have read are in the Old Testament, and how it just seems like God is so harsh. Especially, I was reading about the soldiers that studied the ark and how they were struck, and things of that situation where it's like, well, okay, how do you reconcile that? And that unfortunately comes with the dynamics between Joseph's and the Lord and their conversations. And we don't know what kind of pushback that Joseph had with the Lord at the time. We don't know if there was an argument. We don't know what his attitude was necessarily in that conversation with the angel, which would be important, his attitude about that. We do know through just his actions that he did postpone. There are some historians that say that he postponed polygamy for quite some time. Yeah. So in those actions, we can see that he was having a problem. I think it's kind of like how we warn our children several times. And, at the last, we're like, okay, you either choose to be a prophet or you resign. And I think that that's the point where he was at. You either do this or you're going to resign. And
so we have an account. I was able to find a paper by Brian Hales And I've got it up on the screen here. I don't know if you can see it, but it says several accounts relate to how Joseph appeared to have felt genuine fear at the time. Mary Elizabeth Rollins Lightner recalled that the sword threat was not symbolic. Quote, Joseph told me that he was afraid when the angel appeared to him and told him to take other wives. He hesitated, and the angel appeared to him the third time with a drawn sword in his hand and threatened his life if he did not fulfill the commandment. And then it goes on to say other examples of where Joseph felt physically threatened by the sword itself to the extent that he felt fear. This is Mary Elizabeth Rollins Lightner, who is unique in that she was the first woman, I believe, that Joseph Smith ever said he was going to be her plural wife, and that was when he was staying in her household, and she was, I think, a 12-year-old girl at the time. He didn't propose to her then, but the story goes that he indicated to her that she was going to be one of his plural wives. And I think critics look at that as a form of grooming and also giving a timestamp of when Joseph was thinking about this, whereas if you take it from the faithful perspective, then it gives a sense that Joseph understood that there was going to be something different in terms of marriages in the future. But that's one example of the sword and the angel paradigm. All right, let's see. I think we lost Xena, so while she stepped away, I'm going to get us back. Is our caller still there? Yes, I forgot about that. I still have to figure that technical side.
Case, but I'll have to rewind it. And
no, that's okay.
Her response.
Okay.
But John, dude, hey, love what you're doing. Love your opening up minds, man. Thank you for your service.
Thanks for the call. All right, take care.
All right,
bye.
See ya.
All right, let's see here. Boop.
Okay. Are you there? Sorry about that.
There, I'm here. Okay, excellent.
Okay.
All right, let's see. I am trying to do this and navigate things. Okay, we lost you in the middle of conversation about the sword and the whole paradigm about that. Our caller hung up and our call lines are open again. If you want to add anything to what we got cut off at, you're certainly welcome to, Xena.
Okay, so what I kind of got cut off was there. It is a dilemma. Especially it's something that you would have to reconcile with your relationship with Heavenly Father and what is expected of you.
Yeah.
Clearly, a lot was expected of Joseph Smith. A lot was on the line. If we go with the paradigm that Joseph Smith and the belief system that he is a prophet of the last dispensation, a lot is on the line with him. And I think that the persuasion of our Father in heaven and of the Lord is going to be different than, let's say, one of us who is just, having a hard time doing other things in our life and making those decisions. Yeah. I think that needs to be considered.
That's kind of the line that you see in the essay on polygamy, is that as we have examples in biblical stories of the Lord sending messengers, in some cases with more force than others, to effect his purposes, that's how Mormons can understand that. All right, we've got another call. Let's see. Hello, you're on Talk on Things and Stuff. Okay. It would be all right for you to mute your TV in the background or your computer in the background so that we can hear you without an echo. Awesome. Yeah. William Clayton. He was, one of the most renowned scribes or secretaries of. So you're talking about the story where there was a time that it's reported from a third-hand account that Emma herself said that she was going to be okay, but she wanted to have William Law as her extra, yeah. Are you talking about William Law? Okay. Okay, hold on just a second. I'm getting people saying that they can't hear you, so let me remove and add you back to the stream. Hold on just a second. No, that's all right.
Yeah. And on the call, I have it.
Yeah, hold on just a second. Let me see if I go to my tab here and share the audio. I just want to make sure everyone can hear you. And we'll go to this, and we'll go to that. All right. So, okay.
Cool. All right.
So to repeat your question, you're asking about the story where Emma Smith was at some point said that she was going to be okay with this plural marriage thing, but she wanted to have her own plaything, I think is what they called it, or something. And she wanted William Law.
I think it was sex substitute. I think was the term, if I remember.
Oh,
right.
okay. And then you observed that William Law himself was a dissenter from Joseph and left the church, but didn't really say too much about it after he left the church after the Nauvoo expositor incident.
Oh, he led a good life. He was a good man and did well, and his son really encouraged him before he died to share some of the stories and stuff.
Yeah.
But he said that Joseph Smith had no scruples, and that Emma also had some scruple issues. But he described going with Joseph Smith, knocking on doors, telling the sisters, hey, it's not me, it's the Lord. Let's, and the flaming sword or whatever. He gave them a time limit. He got like 24 hours. So this poor faithful sister is like reeling for 24 hours, and I guess somehow she's going to come up with the fact that it's okay. But and Xena, by the way, Xena, if you can hear me, thank you for having such courage and everything. You're a very wonderful lady. I've been out of church here myself, and I miss the people. It's the people you usually rub shoulders with in the church that are so wonderful. It's when you get higher up is when I have my problems. But you're wonderful and everything, and thank you for coming on. I hear Xena saying that, well, I wrestle with this and I wrestle with that. We're all on our journey, and I think that Xena, you're still, you're going down your journey, but I cannot. What gets me is everybody says, give Brother Joseph a break. But everything that we do on the covenant path or whatever, as true believing Mormons, has to do with what he said. So I think that examining everything we can find out about him is very important, not just his polygamy or whatever, polyandry, et cetera, but you're not drinking coffee or a glass of wine because of what he said. And so, because of this revelation. Mm-hmm. And then he said other things. You go through history and see all of the stuff with this character. He wasn't just he was human, he wasn't perfect. He was the exact opposite of what the church portrays. And what man gets sealed to these teenage girls, to sisters, to a mother and daughter at one time combination? It isn't right. And as you examine, and as I got serious about studying Joseph Smith, not just the church whitewashed version, because you can get sidetracked there, right? But this man had issues. I believe he was a sexual addict as well. And just because they can't prove a lot of the pregnancies, it's also hearsay. I don't know, the sources aren't solid, but I believe it was McClellan was actually doing some sort of abortion type things. And one time, one of the girls was so sick she almost died, and they were real worried about it.
Well, you've given us some things that I think we can have a discussion about. I'm gonna unplug the line, and we'll talk and address those things.
Can I just say one thing? I have a question for
Sure.
Xena, and it's real simple. I'd just like to know what keeps her active, what keeps her going to church. And you said at the beginning she's the current temple recommend holder. That's great. What keeps her wanting to have a temple recommend, knowing what she knows? Because you could have a relationship with Heavenly Father and everything without the constructs of Mormonism. That's my big question.
That's a good question. All right, we'll hang up there. And do you want to speak to that, Xena? That last question?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. He said a lot of great things. Yeah, so these are all things that I have had to wrestle with. Like I said, I've been deconstructing the church for 30 years. I've looked at all these things. I've looked at why I don't drink coffee. I looked at why I don't drink wine. And some of the things they originally were based on what I was taught in the church, but I have then come to an understanding of why I do it for, other reasons as well. So I don't just blindly follow. And I think that it's important that, who was it? Gordon B. Hinckley in 1998, he said, question authority. I've always questioned authority, always. So also because I've lived in such a hypocritical home my whole life, where um, one thing is taught and another thing is lived.
Yeah.
I've had to deal with that hypocrisy always. That's always been an issue. And so because I was aware of that, I never really put the leaders of the church on a pedestal that many LDS people do. And unfortunately, I think that the contrast of the idealized man in the church, in the hierarchy, and the way that they were idealized actually creates so much trauma when the real stories or when some of the facts come out that are completely
Yeah.
contrary. And because I've already dealt with that in my own personal life, just one-on-one, and the betrayal that happens and the depth of that, I completely acknowledge it's there, it's real, and it's so traumatizing. But like I said, I come from a very different perspective. I've just pretty much been on my own.
Well, the other aspect that plays into that, when I think about his questions about, what about these other accounts and what was happening, and they seem so different from what he's calling the whitewashed accounts. Again, appealing to some of these other groups, there's a documentary on Netflix called Holy Hell, and it talks about kind of one of these New Age groups centered on this particular guru. And near the end of the documentary, some of the victims of his sexual predator activities start to come out and say he abused me, and they were usually young men. And then people in his close circle would say, no, none of that ever happened. That's, you're lying, you're trying to do this. And there's this absolute denial. And then later, some of those people eventually admit what was happening was true. And the other victims say, well, why did you deny it? Why did you deny it? And they're like, well, it was happening to me too. And I was in a position where I didn't feel like I had any other choice but to carry the party line. And when you see that type of dynamic happen in those groups, in those situations, it becomes harder then to look at the church history and to see what happened with a lot of the dissenters there and find differences that are substantive or somehow make it be something different, something more. And for me, the William Law story is interesting because he was somebody who, like some of these believers in that Holy Hell documentary, very much bought into the notion of Joseph Smith as a good Christian leader, and was not brought into the secret doctrine of polygamy early on. And so, even Hiram Smith for a period of time was not brought into that secret doctrine of polygamy. And so these men would defend Joseph because Joseph denied being involved in any of these secret documents or doctrines. And then later, when they were brought onto the insider, we have two examples of, Hiram Smith accepted that it was true then and kind of said, okay, well, Joseph Smith was commanded it. He's the prophet, therefore it is true. And then you have someone like William Law who rejected it, but then that changed how he viewed Joseph Smith, the prophet. And suddenly he was able to be critical and to say these critical things. And that's this paradigm I see happening in some of these other documentaries.
Yes, I've seen that same thing as well.
Okay.
One thing that I think we all have a challenge that we all have to figure out is, when I was starting to research all of these things, there is contradicting conclusions that come with all of the church historians and the way that they interpret this information. And we're not talking just small things. We're talking entire different conclusions. And that is very difficult for someone like me who doesn't have time to be a church historian, first of all. I don't know how many people have that time. And so we rely heavily, I think, unless we do have time to sit there and get the actual document and compare the time frame and the context and what year it was given, we rely on the information that is given. And if there is not a complete disclosure of the incident or what is exactly stated in history, it makes it impossible for someone like us to be able to draw a conclusion that is accurate. And so I think all of us have had that difficulty in this process at one time or another.
Yeah.
And we believe one thing and we think, well, this historian said this. And then a couple of years later, we find out, oh, well, this was left out or it was interpreted this way.
And then
so
you feel betrayed.
It's fraught.
Yeah. What I particularly like about the honesty you're bringing to your approach to all of this and your struggles is that it's very different from sometimes, I think, outside the church, we listen to people who talk about polygamy as though, anyone who sees anything wrong with this is clearly just being hypercritical. You're just, bitter.
Mm-hmm.
When no, these things are, they really do pull at your moral framework even if you're going to take a faithful perspective on it, because we all want to try to make sense of it. And the gospel as it's portrayed in Mormonism seems to make so much sense in every other way, but then when you throw in things like polyandry, suddenly it doesn't make sense. And how do we get back to that clean sense of certainty that we seem to used to have? And it's difficult.
It is difficult, and I I haven't even gone into the depth of pain and trauma that polygamy just in itself has presented in my life, just even knowing that that is my history. But I do want to say one thing, and that is as I have come through this process and learned about my ancestors and what they went through, I do give them a tremendous amount of credit for the amazing courage that they had to live this law, to sacrifice what they believed is true. I don't ever want to take away from. I'm just truly,
Okay.
truly grateful that I was not asked to live this law.
Okay, we do have a
gone to
call.
hell.
I do have a call. Hello, you're on Talk on Things and Stuff.
Yes, hi. Thanks for taking my call.
Mm-hmm.
I was listening to the discussion about, Joseph and the flaming sword, and how he, I want to say, quote unquote, imposed, his decision making to this person that was supposed to, I guess, make a choice
Mm-hmm.
as to whether it be under that what Joseph Smith was being commanded of. I grew up in the church all of my life, and I was taught that if a prophet of God did not do what God commanded him to do, that simply God would just take him out and put somebody in his stead. And that, and that was to me, good free agency, because I'm thinking, well, if someone doesn't want to do it, God just chooses another righteous person to continue his work, and the work will never stop. And that was my understanding. But I found it really disturbing that prophets, will do the complete opposite, of what God sometimes does with free agency. Here it is that Joseph Smith was saying, well, if you don't do this, then I'm going to be stricken down. And, where does that leave free agency to leave that other person to say, well, I don't want to do that. I don't want to do what you're saying I need to do.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, no problem. I'll just go to the next person. So it takes away the agency, and I don't know how we can rationalize that when it comes to the teachings that I grew up always being taught in church, where it's like
the purposes of the Lord won't be disturbed by one person. He can always find somebody else to fulfill that role. That sort of thing. Okay, I'm gonna hang up and let her answer it so that you can actually hear her response, because I've learned that that's a technical glitch I have to work through. But thank you for the call.
Thank you.
All right, Xena, what do you think? How do we understand that aspect of Joseph's proposals, understanding that that God could always call somebody to take his place if he wasn't willing to fulfill that command?
There's a couple of things that come to mind. First, I'm wondering if you know the exact verbiage the angel said. Did he say that you'll be removed from mortality, meaning you will have a physical death, or is it a spiritual death that he's talking about?
Well, I think that paragraph that we were reading, the point of that paragraph was that Joseph Smith felt mortal fear for his mortal life because of the threats. But all of these are third-hand accounts, so I don't know that we're going to ever be able to say exactly what the angel said.
Okay, because if we interpret it as spiritual death, then merely that is a warning saying you risk your salvation, which is different, of course, than being killed right then and there.
Yeah, and that's a defense that I've also heard of the Doctrine and Covenants, section 132, where Emma is threatened with destruction if she doesn't obey. And people say, well, that's just talking about spiritual destruction or something like that.
Yeah, it could be. And because I don't have that in front of me and I don't have the context, it's hard to completely make a conclusion on that because
Would
there
it
is, of course, everything spiritual and physical. So,
would it make a difference to you in terms of one being better or right and the other being problematic?
well, yes, to me, there would be a difference. And this is why. If the angel is saying that you risk your spiritual salvation, it is more of a choice. Whereas
Okay.
I'm going to kill you if you don't do this, then I just see that it's a little bit different. It's more of a warning, like
Hmm.
what I would do with my own children.
Hmm.
Um, I warn my children
Please
with
hold.
Oh,
that as
Hmm.
well. And so I just think that it is approached differently. One would create more agency than the other.
Yeah. There's some things to be said on that point because the church is now distinguishing between free agency and moral agency, and it's a very important distinction. Bednar is heading that transition of that concept, but maybe we can get back to that. But we have a caller, so I want to make sure we take that time. Hello, you're on Talk on Things and Stuff.
Awesome. Yeah, I love your work. I think it's a very interesting conversation.
What's on your mind?
Yeah, one problem I have with this entire conversation, debate about angels and flaming swords, is if you look at Joseph Smith's claims as a prophet, it's obvious the guy was a fraud. I mean, the Kinderhook plates were a fraud. The Book of Abraham is a fraud. Any reasonable person would be able to deduce the Book of Mormon is a complete fraud. I have a master's degree in education and history, and I've studied this in depth, and I teach it in public schools. I know beyond any reasonable doubt that the native inhabitants of the Americas are not the descendants of Israelites. Genetics prove it. There's no geographical evidence to support the Book of Mormon is true. In fact, there's more evidence to suggest there's past life on Mars than there is any of the Book of Mormon geography. So with that being said, and if we take the idea that, angels, God, all of this superstitious nonsense just is not real. So when you accept reality for what it is from a scientific lens, and you acknowledge there's no such thing as angels, this flaming sword story is nonsense, then what you're left with is just the simple truth that all Mormons need to understand is their prophet, their founder, was a sexual predator. He's basically the 19th century version of L. Ron Hubbard. And Brigham Young was the 19th century version of David Miscavige. I mean, it's basically 19th century Scientology.
Well, even with those statements, I think you would concede that being able to get to that level of certainty that you're expressing is not something that happens overnight, particularly if in your childhood you're raised with those things put around you as objective reality. And so in order to go from somebody who is young, whose only reality has been accepting all of those things as truths, to somebody who, in your position, feels that degree of certainty about them not being true, there's a number of things of things you have to go through in order to get to that level of certainty. You have to learn how to identify things that are false, and you have to apply that skill set to the things that have been given to you as true. And you have to break out of a culture which demonizes doubt and demonizes anyone who would dissent. And then you have to face the realities of the social implications of losing the ties to your family and your community that would go along with that. And all of those things are pressures that tend to hold those positions of belief in place. But it's not as easy, and I don't want people to take away that it's as easy as simply saying, oh, well, obviously it was a fraud. I mean, it's a very difficult transition to go from a position of belief to unbelief, regardless of whether you're talking about Mormonism or any of these other groups which put out a complete worldview. Would you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. I was born and raised in the church. My dad was, my dad's side of the family were fifth generation Mormons. They came over from England and Ireland with the first missionaries that were sent there. And my entire family are just completely brainwashed and immersed in the cult. It took me 30 years to finally realize that the church is a lie and that it's a cult. And even though I'm highly educated and I questioned everything since I was a teenager, in fact, the moment the internet became available in my house when I was in high school, I was desperate to prove to myself that the Book of Mormon was true. And I'd heard these rumors of Joseph Smith that we're talking about today, and I couldn't believe them. It had to be a lie, because I was raised to think that Joseph Smith was the most perfect person next to Jesus Christ. So when you discover that this idol that you almost worship like a god himself, because let's face it, Mormons worship Joseph Smith.
They hold him in higher regard and esteem than anyone else as the prophet of the dispensation. That's certainly true. Well, okay, so I think I've gotten from your perspective. Is there a particular question that you would like to pose to Xena or to introduce into this conversation that we could talk about?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So one thing that bothers me, though, is, in the wake of the Me Too movement and just all of the acknowledgement from the church and all of the evidence that's been out there for decades that shows Joseph Smith was, in fact, not only a sexual predator, but a pedophile, how can people of good conscience do so many mental gymnastics to dance around the issue that the church has lied to them since they were children and have tried to keep the truth out of view until people are well into adulthood? That way they can completely just dismiss the facts because it doesn't feel right. They've been conditioned to dismiss the truth because it runs contrary to faith. So my question would be, after knowing everything you know, how can you still be a faithful member and give Joseph Smith the benefit of the doubt when all of the evidence in the world shows that not only was he a liar, but he was a serial pedophile and sexual predator?
Okay, so there's a lot for us to unpack there, and I'll let you listen to her response so that you can hear it on the computer screen. And thank you for your call.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, take care. All right, Xena, what do you think about that? There's a lot of you can hear, I think, something that's familiar to a lot of us that have talked with post-Mormons in many different stages of that. And there's a stage where you feel it's almost like anger, visceral anger about that. And unfortunately,
I don't take it personally.
Okay.
No, it's all good.
So what do you think?
Okay, so one of the things that makes me angry about the Me Too movement is not everybody who is jumping on the bandwagon has actually suffered the trauma of being an abuse victim from a pedophile predator. And the experience that I had is extremely different than what is being purported that Joseph was engaged in with soliciting young wives. That it is just contrasted extremely and unless you have gone through it, it would be easier to just label it unto the law being, this person was 14, therefore they're a child, therefore it is pedophilia. That takes away from the actual trauma caused by someone who has done what they've done to a child like me, being age 3. And so as well as the fact that, we can't superimpose today's standards on, no matter how far away. He says, gymnastics. I think sometimes we do gymnastics in the reverse, saying, that because Joseph married a 14-year-old, he is a pedophile. There's very difference, and it's hard for me to reconcile that. Okay, that's one thing. But the other thing is this. When I first went on, I said that this church explains my life experiences best. I haven't gone into all of the life experiences that this church explains. I have had my own experiences with things that are not seen by most people. And most people have a really hard time with this topic. But, and I, I'm not necessarily going to go into it here, but there are experiences that I had as a child growing up in a very abusive home. I was terrified all the time, and I would see things. I'm not going to, like I said, I'm not going to go into detail, but I know that things exist. And the description of Joseph's experience with the adversary is just exactly right on. I have had experiences to confirm these things. And so I understand that when you're coming from a logical standpoint and an educated standpoint, that there seems to be no room for what people would say supernatural, which I don't consider supernatural. I would say spiritual. There's also an aspect about my personality. I'm an empath, and I can feel things that people do not feel. And so that plays really heavily on my experience as a spiritual being, as having a relationship with Heavenly Father and the Savior. Like I said, the connection that I have is very different. And so I don't expect people to understand that. I don't share that with very many people. And unfortunately, that I have to leave it at that.
Well, there's a couple of things that the caller said that is always helpful to kind of diffuse a little bit. So one of them is the accusation that Joseph Smith was a pedophile. And this is something that I think as former Mormons, we really like to throw around because it seems to demonize him more than anything else. He married a 14-year-old, therefore he is a pedophile. And I don't really like that. And I think that as ex-Mormons, if we're trying to engage in conversations with family members, that doesn't really do us any favors. And some of it speaks to what you talked about, where there's a sense of presentism where you can say, well, anybody who would claim to marry a 14-year-old is automatically doing something that's wrong. And I think people will point out that there were people back in that time who married 14-year-olds, and it wasn't that big of a deal, and it wasn't taboo. And I would also agree on the other side that it wasn't normal for somebody in their late 30s to enter into that relationship. Generally, that was going to be younger people. And so there's a little bit of disparity there. But whenever I talk about the Helen Mar Kimball incident, it's not the age disparity, which is the point that is problematic to me. To me, it is the arguments that Joseph Smith brought to that relationship. And that was the idea, as she related in her account of it to her children in the letter that's published by BYU, that she initially rejected the idea. And it was only after Joseph brought the message to her, a 14-year-old girl, that by accepting this proposal, she would be able to guarantee the exaltation or the salvation of her family. And Helen Mar Kimball is one of the people who did grow up under the shadow of Joseph Smith from her childhood, saw him as the prophet and mouthpiece of God. And for him to make such a promise that was contingent on her entering into a relationship that we would learn again in her writings closed her off to other boys closer to her age in terms of social interaction and peers and relationships, then that is something that if we saw that in any of these other people that we haven't extended the divine command morality premise to, we would see that as very manipulative and problematic. And that's without even talking about the whole pedophile issue, which I take issue with. What is your approach to just those dimensions of that proposal?
That's funny. Okay, so I'm a movie buff. I love watching movies and I love watching TV media. Grew up that way. And I see all the time men who are 50 plus being paired with 20-year-olds. Okay, I always take issue with that. It's, to me, that's, a frustration. So I come with that bias in that circumstance. I would have to undo that bias to actually give an objective viewpoint on whether someone who is that age should pursue someone that young.
But I
so
think
I have
even
not
though
resolved that issue.
The difference that I see, for example, there's this great meme with Leonardo DiCaprio where like you can see the age of his girlfriends and it like gets up to 23 and then he changes a different girlfriend. As soon as she hits 23, he gets a new girlfriend.
Yeah, right.
But women entering into those relationships are doing so because of whatever benefits that they seem that they will get out of it. There's no metaphysical promise of salvation of their family tied into their submission to that. So I see that as an important distinction, The other thing that I would enter into this, and I think a response I expected to hear from you and that I would hear from many people, is that, well, that even if that relationship was exclusive and a marital relationship, there was no sexuality involved. And I think that's an important part. The difficulty, though, is that there are examples of other prophets in the line after Joseph who did marry children that young, who there was sexuality. And on top of that, the church's position is that if we find some document that shows that Joseph did indeed have sex with this 14-year-old girl, the church's position was that there is nothing which would be wrong in that relationship. It's under a legal and, well, it's under a religiously legal and lawful marriage relationship, and it would not be adultery. And so that, for me, that's a really difficult position to hold. And when I look at this issue of Joseph Smith and the young brides, it is, again, more about those spiritual promises which were involved in obtaining their consent. Because, you know, we look at these abusive things, and to me, consent is at the issue and at the center of a lot of it. And you can't simply say if somebody consents to something, then it's fine. Because you have to look at what informed that consent. And if there was deception or manipulation or coercion involved in getting that consent, then that's the root of the problem. And to me, promising the spiritual well-being of your extended family, I think we now would accept that there's no guarantee if somebody enters into a marriage, that doesn't mean anything for the extended family in terms of their salvation. We even have, I posted on my YouTube channel just yesterday a statement from Elder Holland talking to sisters in Peru, and he says there's nothing that anyone else can do that will affect your salvation or your exaltation.
Yeah, I just heard that.
Yeah, and so for Joseph to make this statement is a contradiction doctrinally with these ideas, and so it's hard to make sense from a faithful perspective. But if you come at it saying, well, Joseph was just using whatever religious persuasion he could to obtain consent, then he would. Now, I don't know. When I look at Joseph Smith's activities around polygamy, I don't see them as only having a sexual dimension. And so that's why when you were characterizing sexual addiction as being the kind of the sine qua non about sexual predators, I think it's a dimension of it for me, but I believe there's an element of control, influence, and power. And he very much had a sense of tying families together, but from my perspective, that's more for insulation and making sure that you have people close to you who are beholden to you in kind of a way like if we were to see organized criminal syndicate family do that, you know, create mafia ties with other ones, and you know, even the monarchs of England, they were creating ties of families so that there would be some kind of a circle of trust and control around whatever it is that they would try to do. That's kind of my approach to it, which is a little bit different than a simply sexual one.
Yeah, so with that, I also think that there is a possibility that there's the flip side of, you know, coming to understand that that was his belief system. Is it true for him? Can we prove that it's true? Is he with these women now? And unfortunately, you know, that's the part that's the data we don't have. That's the missing link. Yeah, exactly.
Let's talk a little bit about this concept of free agency versus moral agency. Because this comes into play when we talk about the angel with the sword and things like that. And how do you reconcile the idea of free agency with moral agency? And I think that what has happened with the church is they've realized that there's a contradiction there. And so they've stopped talking about free agency and they now frame it in terms of moral agency. And I have a video recording of Bednar really laying this out that I need to remove the Spanish translator from so we can understand it a little bit better. But what he's essentially saying is that God has given us choices, but our role in life is to choose the right, to choose what God wants us to do. And so the free agency that we have is an opportunity for us to choose the right. And so if we do choose the wrong, then we're subject to all the consequences of that. And that is how church members and people wanting to please God need to view the choices placed before them. And so if you then frame it as moral agency, then an angel with a drawn sword does not really contradict it because they're simply helping you to choose the right. Does that distinction that's why you can't use the word free, but you can use the word moral. Does that make sense to you, why there would be a
Yeah,
distinction
in fact, I don't know anywhere in the scriptures where it says we have free agency. It has always been agency.
there?
And agency in my in how I have always understood agency, and with the dynamics of the experiences that I have had growing up with the opposition and the really negative influences that was surrounding me, it was very clear to me that agency had to do with I choose Heavenly Father in the Lord's plan, or I choose the adversary's plan, and it kind of manifested itself in all of my early life situations around me. So some children, I am someone that can learn from other people's mistakes. Some children don't learn from other people's mistakes, and they have to make mistakes on their own. And I view it more as a warning of here is what we have. We only really have two choices. The choices are to follow Heavenly Father and his plan, or the adversary. And so when it comes to everything else, as far as an ethical or moral situation arises, that's where the decisions are. We don't have this freedom to choose from any single thing we want to. And I think that has been a misconception, a misunderstanding, especially with young children, as they think I can choose whatever I want to. That's actually, yes, you can. Of course you can, but there will always be consequences. And so when this is being taught, I think it is more focused on the consequences of choosing which path you're going to take. And you can take it as a teaching of consequences in a harsh way, where you're gonna go to hell and you're gonna have all these things happen, or you can take it in just a matter of fact. Well, if you
There are the blessings of obedience.
Right, there's the blessings, and there's also what happens, just socially if you do have sex without marriage and all that stuff. There are implications and consequences that happen just by regular, not even being enforced, just happening naturally. So that's always been my understanding and my background of agency. And so to influence someone to choose the right, I think, is a moral and ethical duty of a parent. And each parent decides what is going to be right for them and their family, according to their belief systems. And of course, we have to check with society and things of that nature. We don't want to go off the deep end.
Yeah. And really, a part of, I guess, a thread that runs through a lot of the videos that I make and my approach to this issue is really going down to how do you define morality? Like, you just laid out a very good argument for parents needing to teach their children right and wrong. How do you know what is right and wrong? And there's the very first talk, the example I love to give on this, the very first talk by Elder Stevenson is in a church broadcast that's not public. It's one that somehow, I think it's like on the church library. But he talks about three different stories of him and his wife visiting different, actually it's Elder Runlin, not Stevenson, visiting different church sites. First one is Adam on Diamond. Okay, hold on just a second. Hey, hold on just a second if you would. Okay, so in an Adam Diamond, he talks about the sister missionaries coming to him and wanting to know what this is all about. And his wife says, well, I'll tell you. My husband will now tell you the rest of the story. And then it starts with, well, Joseph Smith was a prophet and he had revelation and he told us what this Adam on Diamond was going to be. Then they go to Egypt and there's touring and the tour guide says, how about some coffee? And he's like, well, we don't drink coffee. Well, why not? And his wife says, well, we believe that Joseph Smith was a prophet and he received revelation from God saying that coffee was not for the body. And now my husband will tell you the rest of the story. And then the last story he gives is him at a medical conference. And some guys are going out after the conference on the town, and it's kind of hinted that it's maybe unsavory. And he's like, no, I'm just going to go up to my hotel. And somebody comes up to him and says, can I ask you some questions? Yes. He's, are you true to your wife? He's like, yeah. Are you always true to your wife? And he's like, well, yeah. He's like, well, why are you true to your wife? And posed with that question, there's a number of different things that you could appeal to as to why it's important to be true to your wife. But his response was, well, Joseph Smith was visited by God, and he told us that fidelity in marriage is the way to go. And so what that was informing the members is that your morality is rooted in the commandments and instructions of prophets. And I see that as a problem, because if your only way to formulate a moral construct or a moral worldview is what these men have told you, then if you are holding that view simultaneous with the view that the church holds that these men are flawed and they can make mistakes, then you've introduced a very problematic moral framework into your worldview and your paradigm. Do you see what I mean?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Okay, so I totally agree with that.
Okay, we've got a caller. Let's see what they have to say, and then hold on just a second. All right, you are on Talk on Things and Stuff. You can speak now. Hello? Hello?
Hello? Oh, sorry.
That's all right.
I was calling because from what I read in Doctrine and Covenants about polygamy, is that the whole purpose of it was to raise seed unto the Lord.
Okay.
And that in and of itself constitutes that a sexual relationship is necessary for seed to be raised unto the Lord.
Okay. Well, why don't we pose that to our guest, and we'll see what she has to say. Thank you very much for the call.
Okay.
All right. So, Xena, what do you think?
Oh, awesome. That goes back to a very interesting story that I'm going to share in my polygamous background. On my mother's side, it was my great-grandfather who was polygamous, but before that, the ancestors were crossing the plains, but they were not LDS. They were part of a Oregon, they were bound for Oregon. And previously, I'm not going to say his name, he was wanting to become a preacher. And he was back east, he was wanting to become a preacher. And the gentleman that was training him said he had to be castrated if he was going to fulfill his duty. And so he obeyed and he was castrated. And so now this couple is traveling across the Oregon Trail to, the regular trail, and then they were going to split off and go the Oregon Trail to then become a preacher in Oregon. And at the turning point, they lost their best ox and they had problems with their wagons. So they were forced to go to the Salt Lake Valley, and they were warned, don't get too close to the Mormons. So when they were there, they said, stay close enough that the Indians won't kill you, but don't get too close to be converted. Anyway, they ended up being converted, and he could have no more children. He already had, I believe, 2, and he could have no more. And Brigham Young called him in and said, this was an act of the adversary, because there is posterity that is supposed to come through this lineage that has now been stopped because you've been castrated. So this is a very touchy subject.
Hold on just a second. If you'll hold, we're going to finish this next call.
Okay,
Just
so
wait on hold. Sorry about that.
Yeah, the wife ended up she was recommended by Brigham Young to divorce her husband, to marry another gentleman, to have children with him, and then she did. So she was remarried to another gentleman who was a polygamist, and then she had 2 children with him, and then divorced from him and remarried to her previous husband. So I actually come from that lineage. It's okay. So the question that he was asking is polygamy and seed. Seed is very important. And if you go through history, through the Bible times and everything, lineage is very important. And apparently our lineage was very important to come through this specific bloodline. So much so that she was willing to sacrifice, go through all of that just to have specific children through polygamy. I don't know if that answers it, but I think I'm pretty happy that happened. I'm happy that I'm in the family that I'm in. But crazy story. Just had to share that.
Well, I think we hear that a lot on the issue of polygamy, is people will come to it with the statement that I come from a line of polygamy. And so it's almost like my very existence is dependent upon the idea that polygamy is right or intended by God, and so I can't really refute it then, can I? And I can relate to that notion. I mean, my very existence is dependent on the fact that my parents met in a church, over the drinking fountain at the church in Del Rio, Texas. And so for me, though, that's a different issue, because if I was going to apply that same thing to, for example, like the Children of God, which is a group where they've normalized sex between children and grown-ups, and there are offspring that are the result of those, what we would consider to be immoral relationships, you can't use the fact that there are offspring, you wouldn't want the people who are the result of that offspring to say, well, it's right because now I exist, and so I have to see that it's right. There are things that are true and unrelated, and that's kind of my approach to that. But the other dimension to that is the question of, is polygamy only about progeny and to raise up seed? Why then would it, you would think it'd be bad that we can't find other children from Joseph? And I think the argument I've heard from other defenders would be like, well, the whole progeny issue is not necessarily, it doesn't have to be in place when Joseph does it. He has to get the doctrine so that it can be accepted and practiced. And even if there's no plural progeny from Joseph himself, all of the additional plural progeny that happen in later generations of the practice justify it on that basis. Does that make sense?
Yeah, there's one little detail that I wanted to bring up, and that is, if you just are talking about people being born on the earth, that's not the whole story. It is about certain people being born at certain times for certain missions, which I absolutely believe in. I think that there are certain times where people are supposed to do certain things. As we see throughout history, there are pivotal people throughout history, and I think that everyone's mission, there are missions that we are supposed to do. So that is going back to my bias. So I don't think it's just about just have as many children as you want. I think it's, we are to be here at a certain time to do something specific.
Yeah, and that's a very Mormon doctrine. I remember seeing the concept of foreordination, which still allowed you your free agency, but you were foreordained to do certain things. And you tie that in with, from I think it's the book of Abraham or the book of Moses in the Pearl of Great Price, where there were noble and great spirits that were close to God in the premortal life, which had special callings. And that was used as kind of a justification for why it seemed that family members of general authorities tended to also be general authorities, because they were all part of those noble lineages. Of course, I have a different perspective on it now that I'm outside the church, but you can see how that goes. Okay, we do have another call. Let me unmute it, and they've been waiting for quite a while. Hello, you're on Talk on Things and Stuff. Sorry for the whole time. Can you hear me?
Hello?
Hello, you're on Talk on Things and Stuff. What's on your mind?
Are you talking to me?
I am.
Oh, hi. My name is Angela, and I am a former LDS. I joined the church in Venezuela about 30 years ago.
Okay.
I left the church before this essays came out and everything.
Mm.
And I was, ostracized and punished for leaving. I lost all my friends and family because of it. And I struggle with the people who are still in the church, because when I joined the church back in Venezuela, Joseph was painted as almost as perfect or more perfect than Jesus. And then now that everything is out and we realized he didn't come close to being even as perfect as me, and so they still trying to excuse his behaviors and manipulations and narcissism.
That's very painful.
Yeah. Was it the issue of polygamy that led you to decide to leave the church, or were there other issues?
Among others, the polygamy, because back then I was reading about all the changes that were made to the Book of Mormon, how he was using these tools that were not, all the changes that, that have been done throughout history, and all the killings done by, like they acted like a mafia all along.
So you're talking about like blood atonement and him using the seer stone and all these different things that were kind of not a part of the church narrative, certainly when I was growing up, possibly when you were growing up, Xena.
Yes,
So
exactly.
discovering all those things and then seeing that the truth was very different from what the church was presenting to you was a big part of your journey out of the church.
Yes, and how I was made out to be someone who, you know, was believing things that were untrue, and now I feel like I was lied to twice, because I was lied to when I converted, and then I was lied to when they were trying to tell me that all the things that I had found out were also a lie.
Ah, I see. Yeah. Okay. So this is something that I think a lot of people are having to come to terms with, where you, before the church came out with the essays, you maybe articulated some of the things that you learned from Sandra Tanner's website or other websites to church leaders, and then they demonized you, saying, well, you're just spouting anti-Mormon lies. And then later the church comes out and admits that these things are real and they can be trusted. And it doesn't seem to undo the hurt and the damage that happens in your life because of that, particularly when your entire community is centered around the church. Does that sound like what you experienced?
Yes, I was abandoned twice.
Yeah.
Well, you know, because I was abandoned. You know, I was lied to when I converted, and Joseph was made out to be someone, you know, as godly as God, basically.
How old were you when you were converted?
I was 20.
And you came from a Catholic background?
I came from a Catholic background. Okay. I came to Salt Lake City. I met somebody in the church. We were sealed in the temple. Our children were born in the church. This was back in 1987.
Okay, so the church really wove itself into your life, and a lot of your life was the result of what you're saying is that the church lied to you. So when they described Joseph Smith to you, they didn't describe all of these polygamy activities in your missionary discussions? Like,
I found out, you know, all these things were unfolded, you know, because at first, you know, I joined because of all, you know, all the questions I had from the Catholic Church. It was like they answered all my questions.
Infant baptism, everything.
Right.
Yeah.
And so it come to find out when I started reading all these, you know, documents that were provided by one of my ex-husband's co-workers. And so they had lied to me more than the Catholic Church ever did.
Well,
and so I now when I hear people trying to justify, you know, like this lady just did, all his actions and try to make it as if he had the best intentions, it's really offensive to me.
Well, let me pose some of these questions to Xena, and I'll let you listen offline, and we'll go from there. That way you can hear her responses. All right?
All right,
Thanks for the call. So, Xena, one of the things that comes to my mind when I listen to this woman talk about how her acceptance of the gospel was based on a particular view of Joseph, and then it shaped the next several years of her life, major decisions in her life. And then combine that with some of the acknowledgments that you've made here, where it is difficult and you can understand why some people would see Joseph Smith as a predator, with some of the things that we accept in history, even if you don't come to that same conclusion. Does the church have an ethical obligation to present the full picture of Joseph Smith, you know, dents and all, to potential converts if they are going to shape their lives around the view of him as being the real prophet?
You know, I think clearly that showing more history is important. And so seeing the change just in my lifetime, I think is a positive thing. And I've heard other people say the same thing. I'm really glad that they're coming out. I think the challenge that we have is that it doesn't matter how much is released, there's always going to be interpretation. And it's really, really hard to interpret someone's intention, especially if you don't have the same paradigm or the same ideas of the belief system that Joseph may have operated from. And I have found that in my own life, the way I live, my religion, and I have been ostracized for things myself. I understand the pain, in fact, as I've gone through this process and thought, if I start talking about certain things that I believe or have experienced, I will be ostracized.
Yeah.
And I actually, when I was gospel doctrine teacher, I brought some information up, which is biblical and documented, and I was called in. And I was reprimanded saying, we can't talk about that stuff. And which is hard for someone like me who lives it daily. Yeah. And so I understand the pain of not actually being rejected for dumb things as well. But anyway, as far as the church being responsible, I think that it is always going to be a risk with different people's understandings and level of commitment to really dig deep. To have that information out there. But I certainly don't believe that hiding it is a good idea. Yeah. I think it does need to be left up to people's understanding. But really what it is left up to is, even when I was listening to is it Sandra Tanner?
Yeah.
Okay. I was just listening to something that she was saying, and even her belief in the Bible, it gets to a point where there is a chasm. And that chasm cannot be crossed with the documentation that we have. There is a chasm that can only be crossed with faith. And so when it comes to religion, there is going to be a point where the facts end and faith has to then fill in the gap. And that is always up to the individual.
Okay. I think that informs anyone looking at your perspective a lot. When you admit that there are a lot of gaps in our knowledge about these things, you're allowing the faith that you have in God and His purposes and His plan, and in essence, even though you don't base your spiritual worldview on faith in Joseph, at least faith in him as a prophet affecting God's purposes is a component of that. What is, because I think a lot of the disconnect that can sometimes happen in these conversations is when, like, I can validate your perspective and I can understand where you're coming from, in part because I remember being there, but it's always harder to get that complimentary validation when I'm talking with someone. I'm thinking about my brother. That's right, you, Spencer. But because he's never been in my shoes where you've actually considered the possibility that Joseph Smith wasn't these things. And so I appreciate that you are at least allowing yourself to express that you can understand why people have these other views of Joseph, even if you don't accept them yourself. Okay, we got a call. Let's see if we can do this. Hello, you're on Talk on Things and Stuff.
Hi, I recently called and had the question about the purpose of polygamy as explained in Doctrine and Covenants.
Yes, this was about producing seed, and I want to make sure that more people get a chance to call in. So if you can restate what you want to do real quickly, then we'll answer it quickly and let somebody else call too.
Oh, okay, because the way that she explained it was that she was also seed of that of that commandment. Well, I was referring to Joseph Smith, that the point of Joseph Smith marrying these women wasn't always to produce seed in polygamy. And
so
that
you may have missed the part where I addressed what you're talking about right now, which was that people who are defending Joseph could always say, and again, I'm a critic of Joseph, but I can understand how you could say this, is that Joseph bringing that commandment into reality didn't not have to be about him having children, because if he got the commandment in place, then it could be that all the progeny Could you hear me?
No, you fell off there.
Oh, sorry about that. What I was saying is that people defending Joseph on this point could say that the fulfillment of that part of the revelation of having seed was going to be found in all the generations of people who engaged in polygamy based on.
Okay, but then what you're saying then is that as a prophet of God, he is exempt from keeping the commandments as they're given in Doctrine and Covenants.
Well, no, but the idea would be that the commandment was given to Joseph to introduce polygamy, and the purpose of polygamy was going to raise up seed. Even if Joseph himself didn't have any children, the law being introduced by Joseph could produce children. And I think that is a plausible way to look at it. Since I'm a critic, my response to that would be, population that doesn't actually increase the population of people, and there were not surpluses of women that would justify it either. So there's a number of different responses to it, but any rejoinder to that?
Yeah, that is Joseph Smith, as prophet of the Mormon Church, is he responsible to also live the commandments that are given in Doctrine and Covenants as they are given? Or is he exempt from living those commandments as they are given?
Okay, that's a good question. We're going to pose it to our guest, and I'll let you listen off air.
Okay.
All right. So, Xena, what do you think on that question? Did you hear it?
Yes, you were cutting out a little bit, but let me see if I can rephrase that. And that is just that he, being a prophet, is falls under the same, I guess, moral standing of being obedient to God, and the commandments of God.
Right.
Is that what he was saying?
He was asking the question, is Joseph as the prophet obligated to keep the commandments of God as found in the Doctrine and Covenants? And I think this was a follow-up question to the assumption that if Joseph didn't have any children with his polygamous wives, then he was not obeying the commandment of polygamy as articulated in the Doctrine and Covenants, because it specifically says it's to raise up seed.
Yeah, so then there comes the question, was he intimate with his wives and for the purpose of having children? And there were, I guess, 13 that has been established. So in that case, there is no guarantee that intimacy is going to produce a child. So without the details of everything of his intimate lives with his wives, from what we know, he did follow the commandments and he did fulfill what was written, because he did take upon himself polygamous wives and attempted, I guess I should say.
Okay.
Not to be crass or anything. But
Right. Okay, so you are then accepting that there is a sexual dimension to Joseph's plural wives.
Mhm.
That's something you don't have a problem with. And then would that extend to do you believe? I think I cut out there. My question was, do you also
Yeah.
hold that Joseph did practice polyandry, that he was married to women who were already married to other men legally?
Okay, so what I'm aware of is that there are how many more? 13? Is that how many that we know that were married to other men? I'm not sure of the number. But what I have come across as far as historically, that he was not intimate with any of them but one. Is that what you have come across?
I think there was at least one, but it depends on who you talk to, because some people have a totally, as people describe it, did not actually exist. And so I guess my question for you is, do you think polyandry happened? And if so, is there a problem if there's sexuality in those relationships?
I would think it's definitely different. If you introduce intimacy, sexual intimacy with someone who's married to someone else, I think that's a whole different category, especially because we believe in sealings. Sealings, that part of it becomes very muddled to me. The intention being that Joseph was proven to be a righteous man, therefore these women should be sealed to him. Some had marriages with men, I guess, who were not members or who were okay even with them being sealed to Joseph. I don't quite understand their perspective on that. I do believe it did exist. It's documented. Okay. I just don't understand the intention behind it, and I unfortunately can't. I can't go into the minds of these people.
Right. Okay, but that wouldn't, accepting the reality of it doesn't invalidate Joseph as a prophet. Now, do you allow for the possibility that some of the relationships Joseph entered into were the result of his own, we'll say, carnal mind rather than a direct commandment of God? Or is that something that you've excluded from your view of Joseph?
I don't have enough information on that. Now, coming from the bias of, I'm not going to go into that detail, but yeah. I am more prone to think very negatively of men's intentions when it comes to polygamy. So okay. I actually have to pull myself back on that one and just kind of look at it very objectively. I can't say, but I'll tell you one thing, and that is that even if you start out doing something that is right and good, that lust creeps in. Even in a normal marriage relationship, lust creeps in. And so if you are lustful towards your spouse, under my belief system, lust is not a good thing. And so everybody has to deal with that circumstance. And so it's just really muddled. There's no way to prove that he was never, ever lustful, that he never, ever pursued anyone out of his own desires. And then it comes to the question of, well, is that how it's supposed to be lived? You should just only think that they're ugly and therefore you're not attracted to them. It just gets muddled in that area.
Yeah, it's really hard for me to envision what a marriage would be like when the possibility of seeing another woman that you could have a blessing to pursue, because a lot of what your initial attraction to people is visual and has to do with what people would consider lust, particularly if you're already in a relationship. And so as a woman, a first wife or a second wife, understanding that your husband is looking at women around them as potential marriage partners, it just, one of the things that I do take issue with your characterization early on was the idea that polygamy was a good thing and was a positive thing in the lives of some of the women. And the thing that I came up with, listening to things like the Year of Polygamy podcast and some of the accounts, even your own namesake, your pseudonym here, Xena Huntington, the portrayal of what polygamy actually was in the life of an overwhelming majority of women was not something that was characterized as glorious or good. It was something to be suffered because it was a commandment of God, and it was kind of a trial. And I've certainly heard more horror stories, but maybe that's because they're more salacious than glorious stories about the notions of polygamy. And then when you look at other communities that have created the institution of polygamy, it creates all of these dynamics that we see did exist just in terms of having a lost generation of young men who are competing with the older patriarchs for women that would be their peers, and the pressures that are put on women and the added dimension of, well, God said that you could be this. And then the whole thing about objectifying women. We have accounts from William Clayton from Faithful People saying that Joseph spoke about these women as, hey, give them to me, or hey, there's one instance I can think of that comes to mind with William Clayton where he wanted one of the Moon sisters. It would have been his third Moon sister he married. And Joseph said, no, God said you can't have that one. By the way, would you, think you can get her for me? And it's just this notion of treating women as objects to be pursued. And then when you add in the religious coercive element, and when I say coercive, I'm speaking from the perspective of somebody saying that God said that you're to do this. I view that as coercive because I don't think any man can act as the mouthpiece of God. And that's the perspective and the bias I bring to it. And so I understand it's different from yours. But
yeah.
That's kind of my
thank you for that perspective.
All right.
And in the beginning, when I was talking about my mom and her ancestors and how she said it was fine. That is not how I've ever seen it myself personally. I would be on the side of being Emma. I see myself as being that's how I would see polygamy playing out in my own life. But so because it has been such a painful thing for me to look at, I actually have gone above and beyond to try and understand it. So I started watching like things like Sister Wives, anything that had a positive thing about polygamy, because it's really easy to find the negatives, like Escape from Polygamy, just to see if there are actual women who are, seem to be normal and educated and everything, and they really, really think that this lifestyle is a good, happy situation. But I found myself being cynical, even though it's like, oh, they really don't know. They don't know what they're talking about. So, I come from that situation because it is fraught with pain, and it would be for me.
Yeah. And on top of that, the thing that's really hard, even if you find someone who's speaking positively about it, it's just like, it's not just polygamy. There's this whole worldview around it that you have to put on a good face. Like the very last Sunday school class I ever went to in church, the lesson was you have to put on a happy face because people are going to judge the church based on your life. And so you have to have a smile. People have to see that the church is making a positive element. And that's just in the church as it exists now. And if that mentality that you have to put up a false facade so that people will judge the system that you're living in based on your countenance if that exists in these groups where they have to put on a happy face, then you can't trust when somebody tells you, oh yeah, it's great. And we see again and again people who come out of those systems saying, yeah, I was really struggling. Like there's a whole popular BBC documentary about Scientology where you can see one of the spokesperson for Scientology really yelling down this journalist and telling him he's lying and it's not anything like what the journalist is saying. And then later, a few years later, that spokesperson is now out of Scientology. And you can hear him say, he's like, yeah, I knew you were telling the truth, but I had to fulfill my role in the group to portray it in a good light and to portray what you were doing as lies, because that was the pressure of the world that I was in. And I felt like I was doing good by doing that. And it messes with reality in all sides.
It doesn't. And especially when you introduce any kind of abuse and you're a church member, you cannot show that you've been abused. And if you reach out, I've had all kinds of problems, totally different story, but I understand the facade.
Yeah. All right. Well, I do have to wrap it up because we got to get on with our day. I'm sure people listening have enjoyed your story and your openness. I know I'm very grateful to you for being just very matter of fact about your perspective. And I hope that you felt welcomed and respected on the show. There's been a lot of comments that you'll have a chance to go to both Facebook and YouTube and read and see what people were saying. And once these get published, then the comments will go out and people will be able to add additional comments. But if there's something in the future that you see gets posted as a comment and you want to respond to it, then let me know and we can certainly do a short follow-up or something like that. Anything that as a closing statement you want to make, Xena?
No, but I just really appreciate you being willing to have this session, and I've never done anything like this before. It is hard to come out and talk about certain things. And I just also want to extend my appreciation for those who did call in, and I recognize opposing views, and I do not judge that. I am actually on my own path, and it is not straight. It is not easy. And I recognize those who have ended up not staying in the church, and I can understand why. I'm not just someone that just says, oh, well, I can't see that. I do see it. And so thank you. Thank you so much for your time.
Okay. Well, this has been Talk on Things and Stuff, and we'll see you all next time. All right. Let's see here. I'm supposed to be, I'm like, there we go.